Chapter 66. Godslayer of Yore. The holy apostles at the holy monastery have pretty decent drop rates. Have you guys gone there? Assuming your group cleared that instance, you should have more than just the Swift Retreat skill book. Just wondering, do you have the Desperate Strike skill book as well? Nie Yan asked in a casual tone. Since the other party had Swift Retreat, he might as well try to procure the other skill book he needed. The holy mage was momentarily dazed upon hearing his mention of the holy monastery. He examined Nie Yan from head to toe and shook his head. No, we're far from being able to obtain a Desperate Strike skill book. We haven't gone there yet because the monsters are too strong for us. Friend, seeing as your equipment is good, I take it that you've already cleared dungeons around that level. No, I just know a bit about it. I've never gone there myself. Anyway, how much for the skill book? Despite his disappointment, obtaining Swift Retreat wasn't too bad either. The holy mage felt a little skeptical. Most players who wore such good equipment should have already been through every dungeon at least once. Moreover, as a thief player, how could Nie Yan not have entered the holy monastery? The dungeon was practically brimming with all sorts of thief items, and it was a location all expert-level thieves visited at least once. I'm looking to trade this skill book for equipment. Elementalist, holy mage, or paladin equipment. Any of those are fine, the holy mage replied. He believed that the value of the Swift Retreat skill book was sufficient for several pieces of equipment. Nie Yan made an awkward expression. He had already thrown all the equipment he didn't need up on the auction house. The only equipment he had right now was the Staff of Moonlight Worship, but he didn't know if Yao Yao, Dark Mystery, wanted it or not. I can still sell it to you instead of trading if you don't have equipment. Give me an offer, my friend. If it's reasonable, it's yours. My name is Godslayer of Yore. There might be some distance between us right now, but second encounters will bring us closer. Even if our trade fails, I hope we'll remain on good terms. He noticed the other party's calm demeanor, and he considered his own judgment to be decent. Therefore, he felt that Nie Yan was definitely an expert. Godslayer of Yore? Of the people he knew, Nie Yan vaguely recalled of hearing such a player in the past. Though just slightly famous, Godslayer of Yore was known for having gotten into a conflict with Victorious Return at some point. He and his friends massacred several hundred members of their guild, only to vanish into thin air afterward. Alas, solo players who didn't have strong backings were destined to always be met with setbacks if they tried to take on a guild. Numerous players had suffered at the hands of Victorious Return, Nie Yan himself being one such person. And perhaps because he felt they had experienced similar fates, he now held a more favorable impression of Godslayer of Yore. At that point in time, Godslayer of Yore's fame outstripped his by a great margin. He had chosen to fight, unlike Nie Yan and his friends who had no choice but to hole up in the mountain ravines when they were being hunted by Victorious Return.
I'm Nie Yan, Nerwane Flame.
Since you want me to make an offer for the skill book, 1 silver and 50 coppers. How does that sound? Nie Yan was rather wealthy, so he could offer a high price without even batting an eye. No matter how expensive the Swift Retreat skill book became, it certainly wouldn't be worth more than 1 silver and 50 coppers. That's too much. Even this skill book wouldn't be sold at such a high price. 1 silver's enough. Godslayer of Yore didn't shy away from Nie Yan's frank and straightforward attitude. Since the other side wanted to befriend him, why shouldn't he reciprocate? Inside the game, having another friend meant having another option. Be it trading equipment or forming a team for a raid, befriending a few more experts would make all these things much easier. How many people are in your group?
Nie Yan asked.
Since he needed a team to run dungeons, he'd eventually have to find some members to form one. Perhaps he could follow Godslayer of Yore and his friends into a dungeon run. The game had just recently opened, so the number of players who had fixed teams were quite few. As for experts, they needed to carefully choose the right team before entering any instances. However, good teams were hard to come by. Thus, many of these players who were looking for teams were likely to group together to form one. Nie Yan's inquiry brightened Godslayer of Yore's eyes. You want to run a dungeon? I have 6 people on my side. They're all classmates from the same university and decently skilled. We have 5 players who are level 4 and 1 that's level 6. but he always runs dungeons with other people. However, he'll definitely come with us if we call him since we're all classmates. Our group is divided into 1 berserker, 3 mages, and 2 paladins. I might make a team, but I haven't made any plans for now. Depending on the circumstances, we'll see when the time comes, Nie Yan said with a light smile.
Oh!
Godslayer of your felt slightly disappointed, but Nie Yan's answer made more sense after some thinking. After all, forming a team wasn't an easy affair. Our equipment is more than a little lacking. So, it'll be somewhat inconvenient for us to run the lower-level dungeons just to improve our gear. Not to mention, with the way our group is composed, we often can't find a team to join. The equipment isn't a problem. How about this? When I find some more people in the future, I'll come looking for you guys, alright? Nie Yan replied, then sent a friend request to Godslayer of your.
No worries.
Just call me whenever you're ready. Godslayer of yours heart was filled with expectation. Nie Yan felt if he wanted to continue developing in the future, it was a must that he secured his own team. While finding the right players was a troublesome matter, randomly picking people off the streets would often lead to mixed results. It would be a tragedy if he ended up recruiting a bottom feeder who didn't put in any effort and impeded the team instead. However, this sort of matter should be set aside for after he formed the team. In any case, even if they were bad eggs, all he needed to do was kick them. Since Godslayer of your insisted on 1 silver, he didn't argue any further and bought the skill book for that price. Swift Retreat was an escape skill. In other words, it was a skill used in a situation where a player couldn't beat an opponent and chose to run a situation that was fairly common. Swift Retreat increased a thief's movement speed by 30% for 1 minute when escaping, enabling them to quickly put some distance between their pursuers or even completely escape. Occasionally, such skills aided the player in avoiding a disaster. Nie Yan continued to chat with Godslayer of your. In any case, he wasn't in a hurry to level because there were plenty of opportunities out there. It was a matter of time before he'd catch up with those top-ranked players. Where did you guys find so many medicinal plants?
Nie Yan asked.
He noticed that plants occupied the majority of items for sale in Godslayer of yours booth. We can't help it. 3 of the members in our 5-player group learned the Gatherer skill. We didn't really train much and picked herbs instead, Godslayer of your replied and forced out a somewhat helpless smile. Nie Yan more or less understood what he meant. For players without a guild, if they didn't improve other side skills such as Gatherer, they'd have a difficult time keeping up. Godslayer of your he was doing well for himself since he could equip Holy Walker and Wind of the Fallen Moon. His equipment was even better than many players who joined guilds. Nie Yan pondered for a moment. He thought about the people he could call when he wanted to form his own team. There was Tang Yao, Godslayer of your, and his 5 friends. As for a good fighter, he wasn't confident that Bladelight would come. However, since he was selling the Lion King's shield to Bladelight, it was certain he would reciprocate this favor by giving face. Perhaps he could call a few others to join as well. After that, he could recruit a few strangers to fill the remaining spots and form a passable team. No wonder you set up next to the Alchemist Guild's doorway.
Nie Yan laughed.
Only alchemists would want so many medicinal ingredients. You keep on selling your things then. I'll be taking my leave. We'll talk some other time. All right. Godslayer of your replied. Chapter 67. Alchemy King. Amidst Godslayer of your and Nie Yan's farewell, 2 players near the entrance of the Alchemist Guild erupted into a heated argument. One of the quarrelers, a young man who looked barely 20, wore plain cotton clothing and the Alchemist Guild's badge on his chest. His level was low, so most likely he was only an apprentice in the guild. The other quarreler, an elementalist who looked to be in his 30s, wore equipment of much higher quality. Tall and robust, he dwarfed his opposition so much that the apprentice alchemist seemed like a child. The failure in concocting isn't my fault this time. Not your fault? Are you implying it's mine? Yes. They set me up to fail when I was concocting. Pah! Our captain provided you with so many ingredients, yet they were all turned into useless garbage. We can't even recoup our losses. I heard you got lucky and learned some sort of hidden skill. Good, Get lucky and get out of my sight before I make you eat shit too. Obscenities and curses poured out of the elementalist's mouth. The moment he finished speaking, he slapped the apprentice alchemist in the face and knocked several alchemy tools and other items to the ground. The slap sent the apprentice alchemist tumbling down the guild entrance staircase. As he lay sprawled out, he lifted his head and hatefully glared at the elementalist. Ah! What the hell are you staring at? You got something to say? Keep staring and I'll make you eat the dirt even harder. Get lost. The elementalist's eyes bulged out of their sockets as he glared threateningly at the apprentice alchemist. The apprentice alchemist glanced at the elementalist once more. Eventually, he lowered his eyes and silently collected his tools off the floor. Bitch! The elementalist stamped on the apprentice alchemist's chest and knocked him back to the ground. The apprentice alchemist didn't retaliate. He remained silent, simply staggering back to his knees and continued picking up his things. Isn't he too much of a pushover? After being kicked, he didn't even make a sound. Godslayer of Yor couldn't help voicing his opinion. The scene had left a bad taste in his mouth. The way he dealt with the situation isn't wrong. Right now, he probably has no choice but to endure. I believe by the time he rises in standing, it still won't necessarily be too late for him to retaliate, Nie Yan said with a peculiar expression in his eye. Despite taking on the abuse, the determination still hadn't faded from the apprentice alchemist's eyes. Those who could patiently tolerate were especially terrifying. Godslayer of Yor tilted his head back to look at Nie Yan. Those words took him by surprise. Nie Yan was likely someone similar to himself, a person who refused to be on the short end of the stick. If anyone were to offend him, then they would definitely be met with an appropriate retaliation. However, Godslayer of Yor suddenly saw Nie Yan's expression change to pleasant surprise. He was gazing at the apprentice alchemist like he found some kind of treasure. So it was him. It really is true. Be they enemies or friends, both are bound to be met on a narrow path. Nie Yan muttered to himself in a low voice. He recognized this apprentice alchemist, but it wasn't because they were friends. No, rather they were enemies. If things stayed on course, this person would eventually become one of Victorious Return's most faithful dogs. In his original timeline, over a tenth of Victorious Return's various high-level potions, pills, tonics, and other concoctions were prepared by this one person, several of which could only be concocted by him. Nie Yan had suffered heavily due to the oppressive manpower Victorious Return possessed, but those vile concoctions were also one of the factors that led to his many defeats. While in the wilderness, he had once encountered a squadron of Victorious Return members. At that time, he was unaware those players were escorting this alchemist on a quest, and usually, he and his friends wouldn't be at a disadvantage when facing off against such a group. However, beyond their imaginations, each and every one of those players had taken out some crafty, eccentric pill that bolstered their combat power by many times. Under the effects of those pills, he and his friends were beaten to a wretched state. The apprentice alchemist before him was called Bird Leaves No Eggs. Owing to the fact that his name was unpleasant to the ears, as the bird in his name could also be read as penis, the members of Victorious Return didn't feel comfortable addressing him directly by name. Thus, they gave him the nickname of Alchemy King. This title was rather suitable, considering the numerous contributions his concoctions brought to the guild. However, at this moment, Bird was merely an apprentice alchemist. He had just been kicked, both literally and figuratively, out of the Dark Hero Guild. In a month's time, Victorious Return would recruit and attach great importance to him due to their guild leader showing him kindness and recognizing his worth. This was the reason for his unwavering loyalty and dedication to the guild. In other words, he was a person who did have somewhat of a moral compass. Even if he's the Alchemy King, he's only an apprentice alchemist right now. Whether he'll be worth the investment remains to be seen. Nie Yan pondered for a while. Bird's success wouldn't have been possible without Victorious Return's generous support. They had supplied him with an ample amount of alchemic ingredients and slowly nurtured him until he became the Alchemy King in both title and ability, to the extent his name resounded throughout the entire Atlantic continent. After considering his current financial resources, Nie Yan decided fostering the Alchemy King would pose absolutely no problems. If he wished to succeed in the future, he needed to slowly build up his influence in the present. He wanted to set up his own line of businesses in the game. An alchemy store, equipment shop, auction house. He couldn't lack a single one. However, what he was in most urgent need of was talented people. And fortunately, an opportunity to recruit one such person had presented itself. He felt taking Bird under his wing would undoubtedly be the correct choice. The elementalist departed after abusing Bird a few more times, his mouth still spitting out obscenities as he walked away. While Bird picked up his tools, he lifted his head and coldly swept his gaze over the elementalist's back. A few moments later, "Hey, what was that elementalist's name?" Nie Yan asked as he walked up to Bird's side. He slightly bent his knees and overlooked Bird, who was still tidying up the mess. "Razor. Why does this concern you?" Bird glanced at Nie Yan. "It concerns me because it concerns you. Tell me, don't you feel humiliated? Don't you want revenge? However, you're powerless, and those without power are destined to walk down the path of being disdained by others. Follow me, and I can have them see you in a different light. I can make them regret ever offending you with today's actions." "Why should I trust you?" Bird replied in a suspicious tone. He raised his head and stared at Nie Yan with sharp focus. He couldn't comprehend such a sudden appearance. A stranger had just walked up to him and wanted to recruit him after a single exchange. Wasn't that just a little bit too conspicuous and bizarre? Chapter 68. Alchemy King signs away his soul. Aha! Not a bad hidden skill. But what use does it have for me? When I concoct pills, my success rate is only a third of those around me. If someone came looking for me to create a pill, potion, or whatever, it'd only be a fluke if I succeed. Since I took the effort to recruit you, naturally it means I believe in you. If you're willing to follow me, sign this agreement. Within the game world of conviction, any contract was valid as long as it was within the scope of the real world's laws. Bird suspiciously glanced at the contract in Nie Yan's hands before taking it and carefully reading over its contents. As he slowly read it through, word for word and line by line, he realized the clauses were rather simple. In layman's terms, Nie Yan would provide him with the ingredients and materials required to train his alchemy. In exchange, jurisdiction over how his creations, pills, elixirs, tonics, potions, and so on were used would all be decided by Nie Yan. Moreover, he would receive a 30% share if the sales of his concoctions produced a net profit. The conditions on this contract were roughly the same as the ones given by guilds when they recruited an alchemist. However, he could see one key difference. The contract Nie Yan presented him stated a 30% cut. In contrast, nearly every guild would only share 20% of the revenue at most, even if the alchemist was highly valued. In terms of benefits, Nie Yan's terms were much more generous than those guilds. Yet, nurturing an alchemist gave rise to enormous expenditures, all of which would be taken on by Nie Yan. The number of responsibilities he needed to assume were staggering. This contract. You're really willing to let me sign this contract under these terms? Bird asked, his heart stirring with emotion. Even if you searched high and low, it would still be quite difficult to find such generous terms. Aha! Since the moment I learned alchemy, I've always been a failure in concocting. Why else would have my guild kicked me? Calculating the worth of all those medicinal ingredients I've destroyed to this day, it would probably reach 2 silvers at the very least. Please don't blame me if you end up making a loss. Consider carefully. It's still not too late to renege on this. Bird presented the contract back to Nie Yan, gesturing he could take it back. As the piece of paper fluttered in his hands, he felt a mix of apprehension and anxiousness in his heart. What if Nie Yan were to take it back? What would he do then? I'm not lacking in money. Even if I make a loss, then so be it. I know how to recognize my own faults. However, my insight has never been wrong. Rarely do I ever make mistakes when it comes to these things. Still, isn't 30% too high of a price to pay for me? Bird's voice was lacking in confidence. Even in those guilds that paid well, their alchemists would still receive no more than 20%. It's already been decided. I believe you're worth the price, Nie Yan replied, waving his hand and motioned Bird to hurry up. To gain his absolute loyalty, it wouldn't do if he simply gave him money. No, Bird needed to have goodwill, and bolstering his confidence and making him feel appreciated was a good place to start. Bird truly didn't understand just where Nie Yan's trust in him came from. However, he could tell from both actions and words that Nie Yan believed in his ability. When a person was at their lowest point and felt like a failure, what they needed the most wasn't anyone's pity, but rather only a single line of acknowledgement. Nie Yan's words were unremarkable. His tone was normal, and there was no hidden meaning. Yet they were able to bypass the guard Bird had raised and entered his heart. All right. Bird paused for a moment to compose himself. I'll sign the contract. I'm also fine with you lowering my share, but please don't blame me if you make a loss. Bird couldn't help but repeat the last clause as he gave his response. Rest assured. Even if you fail, I won't blame or trouble you, Nie Yan replied in a calm tone. After traveling back to the past, he had absolute confidence in himself, and he certainly wouldn't be short on money, be it inside the game or real life. The first opening month of the game was merely the starting point of when the real-world economy would connect to the in-game one. Roughly 2.5 weeks later, in-game property would be available to purchase or bid on. Shops, auction houses, land, and so on would all transform into privately owned entities. Various guilds backed by financial groups would certainly go into a bidding and buying frenzy for them. When real-world currency could be converted into in-game currency and vice versa, the value of these properties would skyrocket. The players would discover the shops they bought for tens, hundreds, or even thousands of gold would go for millions, possibly even tens of millions of credits. As for auction houses, even if you listed them up for 100 million credits, they would sell in an instant. This was the result of various large financial groups and adventure capitalists frantically investing in the scene. Nonetheless, owning a store or auction house truly would enable a player to reap enormous profits. By using prophetic foresight, earning a profit certainly wouldn't be a problem. Why would he be afraid of raising an alchemist like Bird? Come the day this apprentice alchemist truly becomes the alchemy king, his returns would be well worth the initial investment. The reason failure struck his father after he invested into conviction was because he had come too late. He had missed the opportunity to buy in-game properties before the real world and in-game economy fully connected. By the time his father entered the scene, the large financial groups had already long divided the game world's assets between themselves and formed stable markets. When his father tried to forcefully enter, he was inevitably met with an iron plate known as the large financial groups. Nie Yan entered conviction before his father did in order to lay out a path. Only then could his family avert the tragedy that befell them in his original timeline. The number of tasks he needed to complete in the first month before the real-world economy connected were many. He needed to amass great wealth, and he needed to coax others to join him so he could increase his influence. In the future, the properties he would need under his banner included equipment shops, alchemy shops, auction houses, banks, large amounts of land, and general stores. Although he possessed the enormous advantage of being from the future, he still understood the logic that a lone tree could only support so much. What did this world need the most? Talent. And in front of his eyes was one such talent. He had stolen Victorious Return's future alchemy king from right under their noses, and he was now fostering their alchemy king under his own banner. Weakening your enemy's strength while simultaneously increasing your own. What reason could he possibly have in not doing this? The sole reason he became Bird's benefactor was because he wanted his loyalty and dedication. Chapter 68. Alchemy King signs away his soul. Aha! Not a bad hidden skill. But what use does it have for me? When I concoct pills, my success rate is only a third of those around me. If someone came looking for me to create a pill, potion, or whatever, it'd only be a fluke if I succeed. Since I took the effort to recruit you, naturally it means I believe in you. If you're willing to follow me, sign this agreement. Within the game world of conviction, any contract was valid as long as it was within the scope of the real world's laws. Bird suspiciously glanced at the contract in Nie Yan's hands before taking it and carefully reading over its contents. As he slowly read it through, word for word and line by line, he realized the clauses were rather simple. In layman's terms, Nie Yan would provide him with the ingredients and materials required to train his alchemy. In exchange, jurisdiction over how his creations pills, elixirs, tonics, potions, and so on were used would all be decided by Nie Yan. Moreover, he would receive a 30% share if the sales of his concoctions produced a net profit. The conditions on this contract were roughly the same as the ones given by guilds when they recruited an alchemist. However, he could see one key difference. The contract Nie Yan presented him stated a 30% cut. In contrast, nearly every guild would only share 20% of the revenue at most, even if the alchemist was highly valued. In terms of benefits, Nie Yan's terms were much more generous than those guilds. Yet, nurturing an alchemist gave rise to enormous expenditures, all of which would be taken on by Nie Yan. The number of responsibilities he needed to assume were staggering. This contract. You're really willing to let me sign this contract under these terms? Bird asked, his heart stirring with emotion. Even if you searched high and low, it would still be quite difficult to find such generous terms. Aha! Since the moment I learned alchemy, I've always been a failure in concocting. Why else would have my guild kicked me? Calculating the worth of all those medicinal ingredients I've destroyed to this day, it would probably reach 2 silvers at the very least. Please don't blame me if you end up making a loss. Consider carefully. It's still not too late to renege on this. Bird presented the contract back to Nie Yan, gesturing he could take it back. As the piece of paper fluttered in his hands, he felt a mix of apprehension and anxiousness in his heart. What if Nie Yan were to take it back? What would he do then? I'm not lacking in money. Even if I make a loss, then so be it. I know how to recognize my own faults. However, my insight has never been wrong. Rarely do I ever make mistakes when it comes to these things. Still, isn't 30% too high of a price to pay for me? Bird's voice was lacking in confidence. Even in those guilds that paid well, their alchemists would still receive no more than 20%. It's already been decided. I believe you're worth the price, Nie Yan replied, waving his hand and motioned Bird to hurry up. To gain his absolute loyalty, it wouldn't do if he simply gave him money. No, Bird needed to have goodwill, and bolstering his confidence and making him feel appreciated was a good place to start. Bird truly didn't understand just where Nie Yan's trust in him came from. However, he could tell from both actions and words that Nie Yan believed in his ability. When a person was at their lowest point and felt like a failure, what they needed the most wasn't anyone's pity, but rather only a single line of acknowledgement. Nie Yan's words were unremarkable. His tone was normal, and there was no hidden meaning. Yet they were able to bypass the guard Bird had raised and entered his heart. All right. Bird paused for a moment to compose himself. I'll sign the contract. I'm also fine with you lowering my share, but please don't blame me if you make a loss. Bird couldn't help but repeat the last clause as he gave his response. Rest assured. Even if you fail, I won't blame or trouble you, Nie Yan replied in a calm tone. After traveling back to the past, he had absolute confidence in himself, and he certainly wouldn't be short on money, be it inside the game or real life. The first opening month of the game was merely the starting point of when the real-world economy would connect to the in-game one. Roughly 2.5 weeks later, in-game property would be available to purchase or bid on. Shops, auction houses, land, and so on would all transform into privately owned entities. Various guilds backed by financial groups would certainly go into a bidding and buying frenzy for them. When real-world currency could be converted into in-game currency and vice versa, the value of these properties would skyrocket. The players would discover the shops they bought for tens, hundreds, or even thousands of gold would go for millions, possibly even tens of millions of credits. As for auction houses, even if you listed them up for 100 million credits, they would sell in an instant. This was the result of various large financial groups and adventure capitalists frantically investing in the scene. Nonetheless, owning a store or auction house truly would enable a player to reap enormous profits. By using prophetic foresight, earning a profit certainly wouldn't be a problem. Why would he be afraid of raising an alchemist like Bird? Come the day this apprentice alchemist truly becomes the alchemy king, his returns would be well worth the initial investment. The reason failure struck his father after he invested into conviction was because he had come too late. He had missed the opportunity to buy in-game properties before the real world and in-game economy fully connected. By the time his father entered the scene, the large financial groups had already long divided the game world's assets between themselves and formed stable markets. When his father tried to forcefully enter, he was inevitably met with an iron plate known as the large financial groups. Nie Yan entered conviction before his father did in order to lay out a path. Only then could his family avert the tragedy that befell them in his original timeline. The number of tasks he needed to complete in the first month before the real-world economy connected were many. He needed to amass great wealth, and he needed to coax others to join him so he could increase his influence. In the future, the properties he would need under his banner included equipment shops, alchemy shops, auction houses, banks, large amounts of land, and general stores. Although he possessed the enormous advantage of being from the future, he still understood the logic that a lone tree could only support so much. What did this world need the most? Talent. And in front of his eyes was one such talent. He had stolen Victorious Return's future alchemy king from right under their noses, and he was now fostering their alchemy king under his own banner. Weakening your enemy's strength while simultaneously increasing your own. What reason could he possibly have in not doing this? The sole reason he became Bird's benefactor was because he wanted his loyalty and dedication. After receiving Nie Yan's unconditional trust, Bird couldn't deny that he wasn't at least somewhat swayed. He silently made his resolve. Come hell or high water, he would dedicate himself to Nie Yan in order to live up to that trust. He had been similar to a drowning person, in desperate need of a lifeline. The lifeline happened to be someone's acknowledgement, and Nie Yan happened to be the person who threw it. As for why Nie Yan would go out of his way to recruit him or trust in his ability so much, he didn't know. Though, he felt this was fine, because those questions no longer mattered to him. Bird grabbed hold of the game-generated pen and scribbled his signature on the contract. Hereafter, all of Bird's crafting profession-related expenses would be recorded by the system and covered by Nie Yan. In the event Bird violated his contract, he would have to pay an exorbitant fee. However, if Nie Yan voluntarily chose to null the contract on his own, he wouldn't receive a single cent from Bird. Follow me, Nie Yan said before directly heading to the auction house. As he followed Nie Yan, he still had no clue what fate had in store for him. Am I really suitable as an alchemist? He wondered. In the future, if he still remained a failure, would Nie Yan tell him to pack it up and go? All these questions were like a riddle that lingered in his mind. The expenses required to improve the alchemy skill were immense. Would Nie Yan really be able to provide him with the necessary supplies? Two people, one in the front and the other in the back, entered the auction house. As long as you concentrate on concocting, I'll be satisfied. Let me prepare a few ingredients and materials to start you off. If you run out, feel free to send me a message at any time, Nie Yan said. As they walked down the auction house's halls, he turned on his bidding device. Nie Yan began to sort through the prices of the goods and bought 4 bags in a row. Why did you buy so many bags? How could I not? An alchemist's bag is too small. They're for me? Bird asked in surprised tone. Out of the guild leaders he had met in the past, not a single one was willing to purchase these bags for their alchemists. The only times these guild leaders would go out of their way to purchase various gifts were when the alchemist was extraordinary or in danger of being snatched away by others. Who else would I be giving them to? Nie Yan replied in a matter-of-fact tone. He also purchased an entire set of alchemy-related wares. They were of a higher quality and possessed the additional property of increasing an alchemist's success rate by 5% when concocting. The price for the set cost him 3 silvers. Apart from the set of wares, he also purchased a large quantity of medicinal plants and formulas. Bird witnessed one item after another being purchased, and all of them were for him. Besides being surprised, he couldn't help but feel touched as well. He had good reason to be surprised too. Nie Yan was so wealthy. He felt truly fortunate to have found a backer with such large capital. The reason he felt touched was because Nie Yan was actually spending so much money for his sake. This boss of his was definitely worthy of his admiration and respect. However, at the same time, a certain question popped up in his head. Was Nie Yan certain he had the ability to return a profit? Nie Yan had a large sum of wealth in his pockets. He could use it to rapidly nurture Bird into the Alchemy King. In the coming years, a high-level alchemist would become as precious as gold. Many of them would be valued at upwards of 100 million credits. The Alchemy King in his original timeline had a worth in the several hundred millions, and out of all alchemists, he was ranked number 3. Considering his current financial strength, he didn't believe he wouldn't be able to nurture Bird into the king he was before. Chapter 69. Sulgada's Shadow. Nie Yan's act of generosity proved effective at persuading this apprentice alchemist's heart, though the unbridled manner in which he spent his money held a much more devious purpose. The further he invested into Bird, the further he would become irrevocably bound to his ship, thus making it all the more difficult to leave. In the event Bird truly wanted to leave, he'd have to pay an exorbitant price to do so, and considering his financial situation, trying to break away was basically impossible. In other words, Nie Yan had accomplished another one of his objectives. By the end of his shopping spree, he had bought Bird 10 silvers worth of alchemy recipes and a vast quantity of ingredients and materials, filling all 5 bags until they were practically bursting. Here, use these supplies for now. Even when I'm not around, focus on raising your skill, Nie Yan said. These alchemical ingredients were enough to last Bird a long period of time. The bags packed to the brim with various plants and recipes moved Bird's emotions. No matter how much of an idiot he believed himself to be, he could tell these ingredients were more than enough to rank him up to a junior alchemist. His experiences with Nie Yan after his termination from the Dark Hero Guild felt like being pulled out of the depths of hell and placed into heaven. There were even several instances he believed this to be simply nothing but a dream. You show me such kindness. I don't really know how I could ever repay you. So for now, I'll simply say thanks, Bird said, his voice trembling in gratitude. Enough of that. These lines are getting too cheesy. It's not like I recruited you solely from the kindness of my heart. There was a purpose as well. As long as you earn me more money by becoming an alchemy master or even a grandmaster, that'll be the best way to repay me, Nie Yan replied, waving him to stop. He couldn't help but ponder over a certain problem. After returning to the past, this was the first time he significantly changed history. Without Victorious Return support in this timeline, would Bird still become a grandmaster alchemist? At the moment, he couldn't be sure since the answer wasn't yet clear. He could only try his best to make it happen. After all, every investment held their risks. Now that everything's settled, go and improve your alchemy. I still have a lot of other business to attend to. Gotcha, boss. I'll be excusing myself then, Bird answered. If he failed to attain any results even after spending so much of Nie Yan's money, he simply wouldn't have the dignity to show himself. From being kicked from his guild to being picked up by a stranger, an ember of hope and a certain desire had arisen from the ashes of his despair. Thus, he felt nothing but grateful towards this savior of his. He expressed his gratitude once more and took his leave. Nie Yan paused for a moment and began to ponder. Such a chance encounter was analogous to having picked up a gem off the streets. Even if Bird couldn't reach the Grandmaster level, only reaching the Master level wouldn't be too much of a loss either. He planned to slowly gather a few people to serve his purpose in the future. Alchemy King Bird from his original timeline had become the first among these individuals he successfully recruited. After returning to the past, Nie Yan was filled with wild ambition. Establishing his own elite team, acquiring an alchemy shop, recruiting a master tailor. There were many things he wished to do. Perhaps one day, he would even be able to establish his own guild. He might not interact alongside them all the time, but there were other methods to manage the guild as well. By using his knowledge of the game and future events, he could still develop his elite forces from afar. Many mysterious and wondrous new areas would be released in future patches. Included, of course, would be new dungeons, crafting materials, and other items as well. Furthermore, there would be intense struggles over strongholds and enormous guilds wars beyond the scope of one's imagination. Even cities, provinces, or entire nations could get involved in these virtual battlefields. In the previous timeline, countless financial firms across the globe had established their presence within the game. The potential commerce and booming economy within the game left many of these firms watering at their mouths. These major figures split for themselves slices of this enormous cake. They opened stores, established guilds, took over cities, and even became powerful forces reigning over their regions. Armed with the knowledge of the future, he was absolutely unwilling to surrender himself to surviving in the cracks and crevices these numerous figures overlooked. Therefore, he required power and influence of his own in order to contend against them. He might not have any significant influence at present, but do remember, great oaks grew from the smallest of acorns, and even the tallest skyscrapers were built from the ground up. The foundations to realizing his wild ambitions were already steadily budding. He withdrew from his daydreaming and began thinking of more immediate matters. No matter what the future held, his most urgent goal right now was still to speed his progress in the game and strengthen himself and his assets. He worked hard to recall the locations of the several other chapters from the Book of Order. As he quietly deliberated over the problem of acquiring them, he also began wondering which ones were attainable at his current level. However, after a brief moment, he reluctantly decided that it was best to abandon such thoughts. All chapters were protected by a guardian of order. Were he to even attempt to retrieve another chapter in the hopes of surviving and succeeding, his actions could only be accurately described as foolishly throwing his life away. A few days ago, prior to his decision in retrieving the chapter of courage, he didn't have much to lose. He didn't have any valuable equipment on him, and at worst, he'd only drop a level. However, even he didn't expect himself to succeed in the end, as he had only gone in with a try-and-see attitude. Moreover, the reason it was a success had a lot to do with the chapter of courage's location, a closed ravine by the mountainside. They were natural barriers he could cross over and take advantage of, and the ravine itself was near a town. The other chapters certainly weren't located in such convenient places. In addition, he now held the chapter of courage. If he were to go and retrieve the other chapters and somehow an accident befell him, he'd lose that as well. The risks compared to the rewards were simply too high. Ever since he entered the game, he had never played with the intention of leveling up at the fastest possible pace. Yet, he still managed to amass quite a few good things. The silk spinner ring, the featherfall jewel, the chapter of courage, and numerous skills and stat points. These things represented the strength he had slowly built up for himself and would allow him to walk even further in the future. What else can I do? Diverting his train of thought, he began to recall of something else. The chapters from the Book of Order might be the sacred objects of those who guarded order. However, for thieves, there was another item that was heavily coveted, a pair of legendary boots called Sulgada's Shadow. If he were to equip a piece of legendary grade equipment, he imagined his stats would be high enough to frighten others. Unfortunately, in the distant past during the War of Sulgada, these boots were damaged and separated into 3 pieces, which were scattered across the Viridian Empire. Only by retrieving and assembling these 3 pieces together could this legendary item be restored to its original form. A piece of Sulgada's Shadow was located in an area not far from Kalor. The area was an ancient city that became swallowed by marshland. There were some memories from the dark era that remained in Sulgada City. The ancient city of Sulgada. Tiske, what a troublesome area, Nie Yan muttered to himself. In the previous timeline, he had been to this location before, but by that time, the piece had long been taken. Over the course of centuries, the city had transformed into an extremely peculiar place. The respawn rate and density of the monsters there were high as well, and trying to enter without a team certainly wouldn't be a simple matter. However, for a thief, it wasn't necessarily an impossible feat. Perhaps he would be able to enter without arousing notice. Legendary grade equipment was truly too difficult to collect. Simply having an opportunity to retrieve Sulgada's Shadow, even if only a part of it, was extremely valuable, and he wasn't willing to let it slip by since, after some time, he couldn't say for sure that there wouldn't be a guild preparing to storm the city. I should give it a try. Who knows? I might actually succeed in collecting all the pieces. Before departure, he purchased a few consumables that he deemed necessary for this trip before leaving through Kalor's west gates and teleported to the surface. After reaching solid ground, he traveled to his destination and passed through a patch of wilderness. The warm sunlight shone down on the abundant vegetation like a blanket of green over this stretch of land. Passing through the wilderness, he eventually encountered an open plain. After traversing through for about 10 minutes, he turned around and gazed east, looking off into the horizon. There he could see Kalor, with its enormous walls and pearly white buildings, suspended high in the vast azure and over the open fields. Above the highest buildings, above the city itself, he saw a hovering ring of light revolving in the air. Under the illumination of the mid-afternoon sun, the ring shone with a dazzling splendor. This indestructible, impenetrable city in the sky represented the Viridian Empire's greatest achievement in architecture. The Viridian mages, with all their wisdom and matchless abundance in mana, had controlled powerful magic beyond imagination to prop this imposing city into the sky, where it would stay suspended for past and future generations. Chapter 70. Natlan Marsh. Going by foot is too slow. How long will it take for me to start riding a horse? It'd be so much faster and more comfortable. However, Nie Yan knew it would actually take over 2 months for horses to become commonplace as a method of transportation. They were simply too expensive. At present, even the lousiest of breeds still cost upwards of 10 gold. It just wasn't worth it. He retrieved a basic haste scroll from his bag and crumpled it in his hand, activating it, before sprinting off towards Sulgata. If there were players nearby, they would see a silhouette dashing across the open field and soon disappearing into the distance. Half an hour later, he encountered a new area as the surroundings transitioned into a dark marshland. This location was far from town, so very few players could be seen hunting here. Almost no one actively sought out this strange place inherently filled with danger. However, every so often, a rare bunch would decide to explore this marsh. Many of them were thrill-seekers who happened to be high-level experts as well. On his journey here, he had encountered many such players traveling in groups. Short stubby bushes flourished all over. A dense fog lingered in the air and blocked the sunlight from above. Once in a while, a cold wind blew past. The marsh left an eerie impression on those who came across it. The earth was muddied and filled with basins of festering waters, where one would occasionally discover the corpse of some unlucky animal rotting inside. A slight rustle or movement periodically came from the shrubs as a few snake-type monsters slithered by. All sorts of hidden dangers lurked inside this dark marsh. System, you've discovered Natlan Marsh. I'm finally here. He examined the everlasting fog of the Natlan Marsh. Passing through this area will take a bit of effort. He cautiously moved between the bushes, wary of the potential monsters lurking nearby. He did his best to evade their sights. However, after passing through a dense patch of shrubbery, his high awareness warned him of impending danger. Rustle! 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 A large silhouette charged past the shrubs and pounced at him. He instinctively dodge-rolled and avoided the sudden attack, but not before getting a good look at the enemy's appearance. It was a marsh monitor, a species of large lizards that roamed this map. The one that appeared was over 2 meters in length, and black speckled its dark green skin. Sharp protrusions grew from its head and tail. These protrusions along with its claws were covered in a viscous green poison which caused paralysis, and those unlucky enough to be struck by this poison would be unable to move for 3 seconds. It was the marsh monitor's most dangerous weapon. Ah, it's these guys. He felt a bit apprehensive. Although these lizards had relatively low health and were quite frail, the consequences of being struck by their attacks were fatal. In his previous life, an expert had once left some words of advice. Under no circumstances should you underestimate a monster, since even the weakest of marsh monitors were still capable of killing you. At the lower levels, these lizards were the nemesis of all mages and thieves, as these classes relied on their mobility to survive. In the event a thief or mage became paralyzed, these marsh monitors could freely rip them to shreds. Even heavy armored fighters were susceptible to being killed by these lizards if they were careless. Marsh Monitor. Level 6. Health. 360/360. The marsh monitor's attack struck nothing but air as it fell back to the ground. Crash. Its heavy-set body sent mud and water flying. At the end of the roll, Nie Yan retrieved his dagger and wielded it in his right hand in a reverse grip. He returned with concussive blow, assassinate, and vital strike. -79. -83. -97. Then he finished with a flurry of attacks before concussive blow's stun duration timed out. The marsh monitor trembled and collapsed. These lizards truly were frail. As long as the player wasn't hit, they were extremely easy to kill. Under Nie Yan's assault, the marsh monitor hadn't been given the slightest bit of leeway and was killed in their first exchange. After switching over to level 5 equipment, his attack rose to over 60 points. Honestly, to the present player base, such a high attack was simply unimaginable on a thief. Coupled with his class innately fast attacks, his damage per second rose to an unprecedented degree. Apart from the leaders of the major guilds, very few players wore equipment of his quality. Even if they did, he still possessed the chapter of courage. Even though he had fought and killed the Marsh Monitor, which was above his level, he didn't feel the slightest bit of tension, as he held complete control over the entire battle. This was the result of his high willpower and awareness, overbearing attack power, extreme maneuverability, and fast attack speed. He killed several more Marsh Monitors along the way. Due to his agility and speed, not a single one was able to reach him with their attacks. The further he traveled into the marsh, the denser the fog became, which obscured his vision even more. This forced him to vastly raise his guard and attentiveness with every step forward. Although he could easily kill these Marsh Monitors, if he were struck even once, they could do the same to him. The dense fog rolled and drifted in the air. From time to time, he would see strange shadows appearing and disappearing within it. These illusions were the remnants of a forgotten battlefield. The sounds of soldiers roaring and cavalry charging into battle could be faintly heard in his ears. However, as soon as the cold wind blew again, these desolate illusions of a distant play would drift away with it. Suddenly, he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. They were heavy, but amidst the other sounds, he couldn't distinguish if they were real. He didn't notice anything unusual until he felt the ground begin to shake. Only then did he realize his disastrous situation. He swept his gaze towards the footsteps and saw a lizard crawling out of a nearby brush. The moment he saw its scarlet-red tongue flicking out of its mouth, a strong fishy smell assaulted his nose. This lizard was 5 meters in length. It was supported by 4 powerful limbs and a thick, long tail that was covered in spikes. Its entire body was shrouded in ash-black scales save for a patch of white which formed a strange pattern on its neck. Even for the native inhabitants of Natlan Marsh, this lizard was a horrifying existence. The white pattern on its neck represented an old mystery as well as death. This lizard was clearly different from the others he had met. The giant lizard noticed his presence and charged. Its tail twisted and turned as it ran in an awkward gait. Though odd as it may be, its speed was not to be trifled with. In reality, this unique gait was the reason it could move so quickly. In merely a brief few seconds, it had already come up to Nie Yan. He activated Swift Retreat to build up some distance while simultaneously examining it with transcendent insight. Serpentine Lizard, Sub-Elite Level 7. Health, 1. 200/1, 200. Shock washed over his heart when he read its name. Why the hell did I end up meeting this guy? These lizards only roamed around the Natlan Marsh and were sub-elite monsters. At his current level, let alone a level 7 sub-elite, even if he met a leader-class monster at his own level, he'd still have no choice but to flee. The only reason he was able to take on Gato the Lion King and the Ogre Devourer was because they spawned in areas with exploitable terrain. However, in this marshland, there was no such terrain to speak of, and it was impossible for him to face it head-on. These lizards were the true overlords of this map. Although the Serpentine Lizard didn't have very much health compared to other sub-elites of the same level, it compensated with an exceedingly high attack. It could also release its poison into the mud and spread it through a mist. Level 10 or lower players were simply no match for this monster in a one-on-one fight. Only a party of 5 or more level 10 players would dare to take on this overgrown lizard. In his original timeline, since many players ended up dying at their hands while training in this area, it was nicknamed the Killer of the Marsh. The Serpentine Lizard closed the distance in an instant and spewed out poisonous mist. The green mist rapidly dispersed into the surroundings upon leaving its mouth. Only a slight whiff within this mist was sufficient to cause one to become confused and dazed. Chapter 71. Elemental Hall Magic. -20. -20. -20. What a strong corrosive poison. Nie Yan didn't dare to meet the Serpentine Lizard head-on. He rolled out of the poisonous mist, slipping past its head, and landed right next to it. In fact, he was so close he could see each ashen black scale. The Serpentine Lizard immediately swept its thick and powerful tail at him in response. The tail resembled a whip as it whistled through the air at a ridiculous velocity. He'd be done for if the lizard's attack were to land. Even if he was lucky enough to survive, he'd still end up losing the greater half of his health. Swift retreat. His movement speed explosively increased by 30%. Even then, it barely allowed him to keep up with the serpentine lizard. He quickly pulled away and evaded the attack by a hair's breadth. Then, he turned tail and leapt over a large patch of shrubbery, whereupon he gracefully landed back on the ground and fled for his life. The serpentine lizard shifted its massive 5-meter body and went in immediate pursuit. Two silhouettes, one large and the other small, rapidly traversed the marshes. Nie Yan glanced back from the corner of his eye and noticed the serpentine lizard shortening the distance by every second. He activated a basic haste scroll and bolstered his speed by another 20%. Although its target had pulled further away, the serpentine lizard didn't falter and continued to give chase. They were known as the most difficult monster to deal with in the marsh. The moment they set their sights on their prey, as long as it was still within the boundaries of the marsh, they would be unrelenting in their pursuit. Nie Yan's mind was in turmoil. He knew swift retreat's duration wouldn't last long, and when the timer ran out, the serpentine lizard would close the distance and catch up. His eyes frantically swept over the surroundings as he searched for some way to live. Although he knew it would be incredibly difficult to survive this encounter, he didn't want to sit and wait for death. When all seemed lost, a surge of electricity emerged amidst the gaps of some distant thickets. His pupils contracted as his heart rapidly beat with excitement. He immediately moved towards the source of this magic. Though a forbidden zone for low-level players, the Natlan Marsh was a wonderland for experts, a statement which held especially true for elite teams. Many of them came here for no other reason than to retrieve a certain item that could be found in this marsh, the Revive skill book. The marsh monitors had a 1 in 10,000 chance of dropping this skill book. Despite its low drop rate, it was heavily sought after because of its incredible value in a team, so much that its importance far outstripped everything else. A priest who learned the skill could revive a fallen teammate. Such an effect was a substantial buffer against potential losses in a run. At times, it could even save the team from being completely wiped. Other than the Revive skill book, players could find decent equipment such as the Moon Chaser Staff, which gave lightning damage +9 and intelligence +5, and the Sacred Wind Mallet, which gave Holy Shield +8 and resilience +5. The common mobs in the marsh did drop silver or gold grade equipment, but like the Revive book, their drop rates were quite low. The equipment that came out of this map were of good quality. Moreover, since a team had recently found the Revive skill book while training here, increasingly more players flocked to this map in search of it. Therefore, the number of experts in the marsh weren't all that few. Elsewhere at an earlier time. "Why hasn't Candy returned yet?" asked a dark-faced man in crimson bone armor. His name was Dark Eternal Sin. He could be considered a well-known figure, though his fame lay outside the game. Before Conviction's release, there were several other famous virtual reality games such as King's Tree and Purgatory. Dark Eternal Sin was the guild leader of Dark Empire and a powerful overlord in these games. However, to the surprise of others, he had chosen not to re-establish his guild when he entered Conviction, and instead he had only formed a team with his close friends. Nonetheless, he and his team were not to be underestimated. In fact, they were quite amazing. His Death Sacrifice +2 armor set was proof of this. It belonged to a level 5 gold grade equipment set, and he had successfully upgraded it twice with fortune gems. Its properties could be rated as one of the highest among similar equipment. Dark Eternal Sin chose Berserker as his class. He had a tall stature, a fairly tan skin tone, and a ferocious appearance. Wherever he stood, he seemed like an immovable iron tower. At the center of his bone armor was a giant skull that radiated a crimson glow. His weapon of choice was a black greatsword which he currently held in his hands. It was excessively broad, over 2 meters in length, and permeated with destructive power. Dark Eternal Sin had brought over 6 of his members to train here. Excluding him, there were 3 mages, 1 priest, and 1 thief. The person he had previously mentioned was the team's thief. "There are probably no more monsters left for her to aggro," the holy mage replied. She wore a pure white robe that emitted a faint glow. Her staff appeared to radiate light as well, specifically from the clear crystal embedded at the end. Her appearance was beautiful, and she held a faint seductive charm. Her figure wasn't bad either. She was relatively tall, and her cleavage was full of allure. When paired with her dancing light gown, she became quite enchanting. You're probably right. There aren't many monsters in this spot anymore. If she doesn't go a bit farther, she won't be able to pull any over. Eternal Sin nodded his head in agreement. At the same moment, a thief appeared within their sights. She could be seen leading roughly a dozen marsh monitors towards their location. Her appearance was exceptionally delicate and pretty. Her skin was fair and worthy of making any woman feel jealous. However, for some reason, she gave off a dark, murderous aura that couldn't be put into words. She was quite agile. She gracefully dodged the marsh monitors' attacks while bringing them over. In the former Dark Empire Guild, she was absolutely someone who shouldn't be overlooked. She was known as the deadliest member of their roster. The type of classes she previously played in other games were always assassins, thieves, and the like. During her run in these older games, numerous experts ended up dying by her hands. Her reputation was so terrifying that expressions would change into horror upon the mention of her name. Su Yen, White Smoke, prepare your magic.
Eternal sin que mandid.
He prepared himself for Candy's approach alongside the monsters in tow by grasping both hands on his greatsword firmly. The spot they chose to station at held advantageous terrain. Su Yen and the two other mages, an elementalist and an arcane mage, brandished their staffs and began casting their spells. Soon, magical energy rapidly gathered in the air. However, the one that brought the most attention among the three seemed to be the elementalist. The air above him flashed and surged with electricity. As he held his staff with one hand, the other was raised in the air with his palm facing the sky. The electricity slowly began condensing above his head and transformed into a massive sphere. Yet the elementalist continued to chant his magic. It seemed like a high-level spell that required at least one set of syllables to cast. As he persisted with his incantation, the magical symbols appeared like tadpoles swimming in the air, dissipating as they rose into the sky. Eternal Sin observed the 10 or so marsh monitors charging closer. In the next moment, he brandished his great sword and ran up to meet them. He let out a roar and used Whirlwind Slash, clashing with 3 of them in close distance. At the same time, a brilliant beam of light and an arcane fireball fell over the group of marsh monitors. Boom! Boom! The 2 spells exploded on impact. Even after their spells landed, the elementalist named Lei Fa, Lightning Magic, was still in the middle of casting. Meanwhile, on the front line, Eternal Sin was chugging an anti-paralysis potion. After he finished drinking it, he violently cleaved at a nearby marsh monitor that was low health and killed it. Damn it! Elemental Hall magic is too inconvenient. It's been so long yet it still hasn't finished casting. Just as he spoke, a giant ball of lightning whistled past his head and flew towards the group of marsh monitors ahead. Boom! The sphere of lightning exploded like fireworks. Electric sparks crackled and scattered in every direction. In a single flash, the spell had annihilated 6 marsh monitors. -360. -360. -360. A cluster of damage numbers rose above the group of lizards. There was a wide crater left in the earth from the impact of the spell. Marsh monitor corpses were littered everywhere, while the ones that weren't directly hit suffered heavy damage nonetheless. Though its destructive power is pretty good. Eternal Sin swept his gaze over the scene. This spell was extremely powerful, but it was only good for mobbing. A spell that took such a long time to cast was completely worthless in PvP situations. After casting the spell, the elementalist's mana bar was completely drained. He sat to the side cross-legged and drank a flask of spring water to replenish mana. Chapter 72, Thief. Elemental Hall magic, which could only be learned by elementalists, came from the various elemental shrines scattered across the continent. It was divided into 16 ranks, with rank 16 denoting the highest possible rank. The 1,000 Swallows burst from just a moment ago was classified as a rank 1 elemental hall magic. It had a long channeling time, requiring a full set of syllables to successfully cast. The long casting time made it impractical in 1 versus 1 battles. As for team battles, it could be easily cancelled by a paladin using silence. Such reasons made it unsuitable for PvP. Not to mention its lengthy cooldown period, which came to a total of 2 entire days. Hence, Elementalists that learnt rank 1 elemental hall magic would only cast them during emergencies. Naturally, if it was a high-level elemental hall magic, for example the rank 16 mantra of silence, it would be an entirely different case. After Thousand Swallows Burst ended, Candy stealthily circled round a marsh monitor's back. She raised her dagger and struck the back of its head with smothering strike. The dagger flickered with a cold glint as she arced the blade through her target's neck. Her methods were efficient and brutal. The low-health marsh monitor stood no chance and collapsed to the ground. Flame slash! Eternal Sin cleaved down as his greatsword was enveloped by an intense blaze. Boom! His blade directly beheaded and cauterized a marsh monitor's neck. The raging flames continued burning until its entire body was charred black. The 5 remaining marsh monitors charged past and made a beeline for the 3 mages in the rear. However, Eternal Sin roared and stopped them in their tracks by using Taunt. The moment his taunt came out, the 5 lizards immediately aggroed onto him and unleashed a flurry of attacks. -15, -16, -18. Several damage values emerged and rose above his head. Fortunately, his defense was solid, so despite being encircled, these lizards posed no threat. The priest in the rear cast Dispel, removing the paralysis debuff, then followed up with Lesser Heal. As a result, Eternal Sin immediately recovered a large chunk of health. With all 5 marsh monitors aggroed onto him, Eternal Sin brandished his greatsword and activated Whirlwind Slash. Immediately, his spinning blade swept through their bodies and dealt over 50 damage to each. Su Yen, White Smoke, and the arcane mage continued casting spells in the rear. Despite being besieged by marsh monitors, Eternal Sin firmly held his ground like an immovable boulder. The earth was splattered with blood, some from the lizards and some his own. Amidst the madness that shone in his eyes, he erupted in a frenzy intertwined with ruthlessness and bloodlust. His entire being was akin to an enraged beast, his every action hammering fear into one's heart. Su Yen and the others couldn't help but tremble when witnessing Eternal Sin in such a state. He was simply a killing machine that maniacally swung his sword for slaughter. The only one who remained unperturbed was Candy. She curled her lips and uttered, "Boring," before lightly yawning. She then rummaged through her knapsack and took out a piece of fruit candy that could be bought at the NPC general store. Popping it into her mouth, she entered stealth and approached a monitor lizard from the rear. Smothering Strike. Upon activating the skill, she struck the lizard on the backside of its head with the pommel of her dagger. Now that it was stunned, her blade easily pierced its flesh and sent out a spray of blood. Eternal Sin and his team had fairly good synergy. Within a brief time span, they were able to easily make short work of the dozen or so lizards. Candy retrieved her dagger from a marsh monitor's corpse and calmly wiped off the blood. "Big guy, the monsters here are too scarce. Let's go somewhere else," Candy said to Eternal Sin. Only Candy would dare to call him in such a way since the others didn't have the nerves to do so. This sense of familiarity came from having known each other for a long time. As for how long, no one knew. However, one fact remained consistent throughout the years. Whenever Dark Empire was overturning the entire world of those previous games, Candy was never absent. Although Candy and Eternal Sin didn't establish a guild, the rallying power they held within conviction was still extremely astonishing. Eternal Sin strapped his greatsword on his back and turned to face the other members. "Let's take a small break. We'll switch locations afterwards." And so, atop a mound of dry earth under the shade of a tree, 6 players rested while eating bread and drinking spring water. Although the clamor of battle had recently ended, Nie Yan continued heading towards its source as he dashed through the marsh. Eventually, 6 players entered his sight. At the same moment, Eternal Sin and his party also discovered him and quickly stood up in response. Nie Yan observed the other party's equipment as he neared, and he was particularly surprised by Eternal Sin's equipment. What a strong group of players! Even then, the serpentine lizard was closing in from the rear, so he no choice but to disregard their strength and press on. "It's a thief," Eternal Sin said, after getting a better look at Nie Yan, though in no way did he believe this single thief would pose a threat. Why? Because the strongest thief in the game was standing right here beside them. Not to mention, with his high health and defense, There was simply no reason to fear any thief in the first place. Even if Nie Yan's equipment did look somewhat decent to him, to this day, there had never been a single thief that could defeat him. This wasn't confidence born out of arrogance but rather confidence that came from absolute strength.
Oh!
Candy's figure gradually faded before completely merging with the greenery in the background. As Nie Yan ran, his eyes fell on a certain patch of shrubbery off in the distance. The other side's prowess using stealth was near flawless. Ordinary players or even experts might not be able to detect her presence, but she definitely wouldn't go unnoticed by him. Candy felt a tinge of surprise as she saw Nie Yan's gaze focus on her.
Oh!
It seems they encountered an interesting fellow. Though he could clearly sense the open hostility in the moment he appeared before them, his circumstances were quite dire since the serpentine lizard was already close to his heels. He had to take this gamble, but he wasn't naive enough to believe these six would help him out of the kindness of their hearts. So, he was left with no other choice. He would pass the serpentine lizard off to them and make use of their power in order to survive. He accelerated his pace and bolted straight for Eternal Sin and the others. Eternal Sin unstrapped his greatsword and firmly grasped it in his hand. The blade was at an inclined angle and firmly planted on the earth so he could be ready to receive his opponent. He stood no further than 2 meters from his mages. Though he personally wasn't afraid, things could get quite dangerous if he let this thief enter their rear line. Eternal Sin, who wore the death sacrifice set, resembled an iron wall that blocked the path to the 3 mages behind him. Just as Eternal Sin was prepared to cut down this thief, the bushes in the distance stirred with activity, causing his heart to leap in surprise. Don't tell me there's more people at his rear? He soon discovered what followed the thief from behind wasn't a player but rather a gigantic lizard. It was several times larger than the ordinary lizard monsters in this area. Shit! It's a serpentine! Candy drew in a breath of cold air upon seeing the lizard's distinct gait. They were a terrifying existence, apex predators, killers of the marsh, and capable of reaching lightning-fast speeds. Level 7 sub-elite? Eternal Sin stammered and retreated several steps back to the mound. They could have easily handled the situation if the second figure had been another player, but what arrived was a level 7 sub-elite instead. It was an existence that was difficult to deal with even at their levels. Not to mention their priest had yet to learn Revive. It would be a disastrous loss if 1 or 2 of them ended up dying due to this. As Nie Yan drew increasingly near, the elementalist at Eternal Sin's rear brandished their staff and sent lightning crackling toward him. This thief's intentions were already quite obvious to them. He wanted to pass the serpentine lizard off to them. Naturally, Eternal Sin and his group wouldn't be polite. None of them dared to receive such a flaming hot potato. Behind the bolt of lightning, Su Yen and the arcane mage's attacks arrived in tow. By this time, the serpentine lizard was basically nipping at his heels. It wound up its body, and in the next instant, pounced at him like an arrow. In response, Nie Yan rolled to the side and evaded its attack and incidentally, lay FA's, lightning magic, bolt of lightning da bang. However, he was unable to avoid a holy strike aimed prior to where he rolled to. -67. System. A member of the party led by player Eternal Sin has taken the initiative to attack you. You are free to retaliate in legitimate self-defense. Duration: 30 minutes. Damn it! What kind of damage is that? Nie Yan inwardly cried out in alarm. He rolled again and avoided the oncoming arcane fireball. Just as the spell passed by him, he felt a murderous intent nearing his back. Their thief. Chapter 73, Tricked. Cloaking and awareness were directly opposing stats. In situations where the opponent was a thief under the effects of stealth, they could only be seen clearly if the other party's awareness was higher than the thief's cloaking by 50% or more. When the two stats were equal, the thief could be spotted if the other player concentrated hard enough while searching. If the thief was good, however, then in situations where cloaking exceeded the defending side's awareness, the opposing player would be stunned before they even had a chance to react. Naturally, this wasn't to say that when a thief was discovered their attacks could be easily avoided. After all, thieves were innately fast, whether it be in terms of movement or attack. In a certain region within the marsh, the air distorted to reveal a silhouette. Its owner was Candy, who had activated stealth and disappeared earlier on. She had re-emerged at Nie Yan's rear. Her attack was terrifyingly fast as she attempted to strike him in the back of the head. A single concussive blow would leave him stunned long enough to allow the mages to send him directly to the graveyard. However, before Candy even approached his back, he had already discovered her presence. Those 19 points in awareness weren't just for show. He smoothly leaned to the side and avoided her strike. After dodging, he pivoted his foot and struck back with his own concussive blow, aimed directly at her temple. What a decisive attack! Candy rapidly pulled back, evading by just a hair's breadth, before distancing herself from Nie Yan. This thief had somehow discovered her. Just how high was his awareness? Not to mention his quick reaction speed and even fiercer counter. His movements were as natural as the floating clouds and flowing waters, a matchless style which left her heart in shock. What a strong guy! At the moment, the average player was still quite low level, and although there weren't many methods of attack, close combat was the best judge of the opposing player's experience and skills. An expert. Candy was instantly convinced of this thought, though she wasn't disheartened. In fact, she was delighted since things wouldn't be interesting otherwise. Just as their exchange ended, the serpentine lizard chose this moment to charge at Nie Yan from the side. Its gigantic body drew increasingly closer as its gaping maw appeared wider with each passing millisecond. He sidestepped the attack, locked his eyes onto a tree in the distance, then extended his left hand and shot out a line of webbing from his silk spinner ring. He jerked the web line and pulled himself out of immediate attack range. The serpentine lizard's attack had struck thin air yet again, enraging it to no end. It swung its body around and charged at Nie Yan once more. In the brief moment when it had lost sight of him, Nie Yan activated a basic haste scroll and bolted towards the three mages at Eternal Sin's rear. For the sake of preserving his life, he had no choice but to lead the serpentine lizard towards them. Otherwise, he'd have no chance of surviving. Eternal Sin firmly grasped his greatsword and blocked the approaching opponent's path. He readied himself and prepared to attack when Nie Yan entered his range. A thief's innately frail defense meant that as long as he got in a few strikes, they could be easily killed. As Nie Yan drew closer, Eternal Sin stared fixedly at him and the serpentine lizard in tow. At this point, it would be hard to avoid a confrontation with the lizard, though the most immediate issue was Nie Yan. They needed to kill him off. Otherwise, it had become quite annoying if he started wreaking havoc while they fought it. Although Nie Yan initially had no enmity with Eternal Sin and his group, when he leads such a disaster towards them, it'd be quite normal for them to hate his guts. Yet at the same time, this was also the wilderness, a place where life or death depended on skill. So even if they died, they would have no one to blame but themselves since they lacked the strength to survive. By now the serpentine was about to overtake Nie Yan, but the latter was likewise about to enter Eternal Sun's range. Eternal Sin brandished his blade and completely sealed off his path. It appeared he was going to match the serpentine lizard and perform a pincer attacker. Nie Yan fully understood that the other party really wanted him dead. There was an enemy in front and another chasing from behind. He was being forced onto a narrow path. If he were to have the slightest slip-up, the serpentine lizard would pounce on him and Eternal Sin wouldn't hesitate in cutting him down where he stood. Seeing his opponent enter striking distance, Eternal Sin directly slashed down as a blade of light flew towards Nie Yan's face. In the same instant, Nie Yan fiercely pivoted and leaped toward a nearby thicket. The blade of light struck Nie Yan mid-leap and drew blood, followed by two explosions as a holy smite and a bolt of lightning landed afterwards. -65. -89. -72. Several damage values rose above his head, and he had nearly lost all of his health with a little over a tenth remaining. Shit. Just how far can he leap? Eternal Sin immediately felt his heart sink after seeing Nie Yan successfully escape through the bushes. How high or how far a player could leap was based on the strength and jump stats as well as weight load. The upper limit of how high a player could leap was 5 meters. The higher strength and jump were, the more powerful the leap. On the other hand, as weight increased, jump range decreased. Fortunately for Nie Yan, his weight load was light, and he possessed the chapter of courage which provided 15 points in jump. It was no wonder his leap was so astonishing. Eternal Sin was confident in obstructing and pinning Nie Yan down. He had even perfectly matched the timing of his attack with the serpentine lizard. If things had proceeded without a hitch, his opponent would have been dead in less than 5 seconds. Yet, never did he expect that Nie Yan would turn into a frog and bound across the bushes to escape. In the next moment, the serpentine lizard arrived at Nie Yan's previous position. It had lost sight of its target. Fortunately, there was new prey standing right beside it. It immediately turned around and pounced at Eternal Sin. He had been tricked. As he stared at the giant lizard already in mid-leap, he knew he didn't have the chance to retreat. He brandished his greatsword and stepped forward to meet it head-on. "Everyone, be careful of that thief. Candy, go after him," Eternal Sin promptly commanded, then focused on repelling the serpentine lizard's attacks. He feared Nie Yan would turn back and sneak attack the mages in the backline. The situation could get dangerous if Nie Yan got within melee range of the mages. His could easily overwhelm them using his skill and agility, especially against the priest who couldn't put up much of a fight. "No worries. Just leave it to me." Candy's eyes flashed with a peculiar expression. This guy's quite skilled. After successfully baiting Eternal Sin into engaging the serpentine lizard, Nie Yan turned around to examine the scene. Seeing as Eternal Sin and the serpentine were already fighting, he felt somewhat alleviated of his stress. "I finally got that lizard off my tail. Should I take advantage of the situation to get rid of them, or should I just leave?" Nie Yan pondered for a moment. "Let's watch and see for now." Nie Yan entered stealth and began blending in with the background before completely disappearing from view. The mages at the rear spotted Nie Yan's dissipating silhouette from across the bushes. When they noticed they couldn't detect his presence, they couldn't help bunching up a little. Despite their surroundings seeming completely empty, they felt an enormous pressure weighing down on them. Candy also entered stealth and scanned the surrounding for traces of Nie Yan. However, she didn't dare to stray too far from the mages. A thief in the shadows posed too much of a danger to lightly armored professions. The only sound that emanated from the scene was the battle between Eternal Sin and the serpentine lizard. Eternal Sin's defenses were high so he could hold it off temporarily. After a short while, the mages and the priest also began casting their spells. Nie Yan glanced at his health bar. Only a slight sliver remained. He hid behind the cover of the bushes and began applying bandages. +20. +20. +20. He restored 200 health after 10 seconds. Only then did he loosen his mind that had been on edge ever since he encountered the serpentine lizard. Afterwards, he quietly observed the battle. Eternal Sin firmly held his ground as the priest healed him and mages dealt damage. Their composure and synergy left him wondering why he didn't recognize them. They were such a strong team. However, after thinking about it for a while, it made sense. In his original timeline, there were countless experts who were reserved and didn't reveal their strength. It was quite normal that he didn't recognize them. Chapter 74. Foiled Ambush. The serpentine lizard's attacks were especially ferocious, and Eternal Sin found them somewhat difficult to endure despite having very high defense. Hiss! Hiss! Just as its scarlet tongue flickered in and out, the lizard opened its jaw and spat out a green globular substance. Upon contact with the air, it near instantaneously turned gaseous, rapidly expanded, and enshrouded everything within a 2-meter radius in a poisonous mist. The team's priest, Death Speech, responded and hurriedly cast a spell as a gentle ray of pure white fell on Eternal Sin's position. The light reacted with the poisonous mist and within an instant, caused it to dilute by a great degree. Eternal Sin glanced at his health bar which only had 160 health remaining, though he didn't have much time to ruminate over it as the serpentine lizard resumed its assault. He raised his greatsword in an effort to resist its attack, but the lizard latched onto him and bit out a chunk of flesh. -76. Tendon break. Eternal Sin struck out in retaliation. The serpentine lizard's movements immediately turned sluggish as it temporarily entered a crippled state. Taking advantage of this brief window, he hurriedly drew back in order to create some distance. Just at that time, Lei Lightning Magic, the elementalist, finished his incantation and cast Freeze Frost, whereupon a thin layer of ice began covering the serpentine lizard and slowed its movements even more. This freeze effect was a trademark of an elementalist's ice magic. Death Speech promptly followed up by casting Lesser Heal, while Eternal Sin downed a basic recovery potion to supplement the healing. After the initial burst of healing, the red of his health bar continued to steadily rise. Even while recovering, Eternal Sin stayed on full alert as he knew that Thief didn't go too far. If he emerged and caught them off guard, it would be difficult to predict the outcome of the battle. Just as his health replenished by 3/4, the cripple and freeze debuffs wore off, and the Serpentine Lizard came rushing forward. Sub-elite monsters were truly too difficult to deal with. Even Eternal Sin, who wore Death's Sacrifice +2, lost health at such a rapid pace. If it were another team with worse equipment, they would have long been wiped by now. Despite their combined efforts, the Serpentine Lizard still had a little over 70% health remaining. Candy, have you found him yet? No, I have no idea where that slippery bastard ran off to. Everyone, remain alert. Su Yan, White Smoke, be ready to use that spell.
Understood, Su Yan replied promptly.
After having known each other for so long, Eternal Sin only needed to say a few words and she would understand what was needed of her. Although Nie Yan couldn't listen in on what Eternal Sin and his team were conversing about, he knew it concerned him. However, they were heavily overestimating themselves. As a thief with over 10 years of experience, he wouldn't allow himself to be caught so easily. Their team isn't bad. They might actually be able to kill it. He stared intently at the ferocious Serpentine Lizard. A level 7 sub-elite. Who knows what sort of items it'll drop? For the time being, he didn't have any immediate plans of going against Eternal Sin and his team. However, it wouldn't necessarily be too late to decide after the two sides wore each other out a little further. Eternal Sin brandished his greatsword. He fiercely slashed down on the Serpentine Lizard's body and dealt incredibly high damage. How much mana left? Eternal Sin asked in the team chat. 67%. 78%. 32%. Lei Fa cast his gaze at Eternal Sin's expression, afraid that he would get angry. Why is it so low? Eternal Sin furrowed his brows and asked. When the battle started, my mana wasn't fully recovered. Then later on, I used several high-damage spells. Enough. Just conserve what's left of it. Eternal Sin didn't say more after listening to Lei Fa's explanation. Lei Fa switched to the low mana cost Ice Arrow. After a while, his mana was still low, so he drank a basic mana potion and restored his mana to 67%. Under the constant battering spells, the Serpentine Lizard's health eventually fell to a little over 20%. It only has around 200 health left. By this point, Eternal Sin's mind was already tense to the point of snapping. Once its health fell below the 20% line, the Serpentine Lizard's skin began changing into a peculiar red hiss. It let out a strange cry, and subsequently, the ground beneath Eternal Sin's feet turned muddy. He was inwardly alarmed when he discovered he couldn't pull out his feet, which began to sink. Not even a second later, the Serpentine Lizard leapt at him again. He activated Whirlwind Slash and successfully repelled it several steps back. Seeing Eternal Sin trapped in the mud pit, Candy suddenly thought of something and anxiously commanded, Death Speech, use Illuminate. The priest didn't dare to dally after hearing Candy's order. He extended his palm and sent a sphere of light flying into the air, whereupon it released a blinding radiance that fell to the earth like a curtain of silk. Illuminate was a spell that revealed everything within a 5-meter radius of the priest. As the spell revealed its effects, the outline of a silhouette wielding 2 daggers gradually emerged behind the priest. The silhouette was already mid-strike, the pommel of its dagger going straight for the back of the priest's head. He's there! Candy raised her dagger and dashed in to intercept Nie Yan. The sound of blades clashing against each other reverberated through the air. Nie Yan had been hard-pressed to find an opening. Nonetheless, his patience had persevered. Taking advantage of the havoc caused by the Serpentine Lizard's skill, he silently approached the priest's back, and just as he was about to deliver fate-sealing blow, his intentions had been unexpectedly seen through, and he was intercepted mid-attack. Now, he was forced into a passive state defending against Candy's attacks. His plan had been to kill the priest named Death Speech first. With the healer down, Elemental Sin, who was fighting the serpentine lizard, would soon follow. It was killing two birds with one stone. He just never expected that he would be seen through in spite of his flawless stealth. This was the first time he failed an ambush since reincarnating. After Candy intercepted him, the priest successfully escaped. Since his sneak attack had failed, he activated swift retreat and pulled back rapidly. Boom! He dodged the bolt of lightning just in the nick of time. Following the bolt of lightning, he had been struck by a ray of light, though it had dealt no damage. Standing in the distance, Nie Yan's lips curved into a smirk. Let's just see where you can hide to now that you've been marked. As Nie Yan retreated, a bright floating mark had appeared floating above his head. No matter where he went, the mark would follow and reveal his position. I've been marked! He inwardly cried out in alarm and hastily made his retreat. Candy followed in pursuit, but she was noticeably slower than him. After activating swift retreat, he had become too fast for her. She had no chance of catching up to him. The gap increasingly widened, and he soon broke away. These players were simply too strong. It would be rather difficult taking advantage of them. Thus, he had no choice but to give up and dashed out of the area. Candy, how did you discover him? Death Speech excitedly said, after being barely rescued from the clutches of death. That thief had been really close to his position. If she was even a second later, not only would he have died but eternal sin would have as well. I didn't. My awareness isn't that high. I was actually puzzled for quite a long time. Why hadn't that thief acted by now? There were already several good opportunities that had gone by. So, I put myself in his shoes and thought to myself, when would be a good time to attack? When I saw Tall Guy sink into that quagmire, I guess that was probably the best opportunity, which was why I had you cast Illuminate. I didn't expect that I'd actually discover him. Candy replied. If she had been a step slower, Death Speech would have lost his life. Truthfully, that thief's stealth abilities could be described as perfect. The reason she had found him could be mostly attributed to good luck. She peered past the thickets and into the distance. That thief had long disappeared within Natlon Marsh's fog. Since Glimmer Mark had a duration of 2 minutes, if he were to come again within that time, they would immediately discover him. Thus, they could rest assured that he wouldn't mount another ambush. Chapter 75. Turn of Events. Nie Yan fled the battle, but he didn't immediately leave the area. Instead, he took a detour and circled round the perimeter before stopping to scan his surroundings. Eventually, he spotted a slope not too far in the distance. He dashed toward the slope and promptly arrived at its peak, whereupon he looked over in the direction of Eternal Sin and his team. Despite the somewhat low visibility, the light show of magic and clamor signaled that the battle was still ongoing and quite fierce. At first, for the sake of preserving his life, he only planned to borrow their hand in killing the serpentine lizard and nothing else. However, since they tried to kill him, he wouldn't sit by idly and let them enjoy their meal in peace. No, the temptation of obtaining the equipment dropped by a level 7 sub-elite couldn't be abandoned so easily. Thus, Candy and the others were unaware that Nie Yan hadn't actually fully retreated but was instead spying on them from atop a slope. After believing they had finally driven that hateful thief away, Eternal Sin and his team inwardly breathed a sigh of relief. Just a moment ago, he was in quite a panic due to being rooted by the quagmire. If anything had happened to the priest in the rear, he would have been a goner as well. Luckily, Candy discovered that thief before it was too late and helped them avert a disaster that could have wiped the team. Good work! You all did well, Eternal Sin praised in the team chat. We were just lucky. That guy isn't so easy to deal with. We need to be careful if we ever encounter him in the future, Candy replied, ending the celebrations early. Eternal Sin assumed that with her skills, the other side wouldn't be able to gain the slightest advantage over her, but it was clear that assumption was wrong. That thief was quite astonishing. After forcing Nie Yan away, killing the serpentine lizard became much more relaxed. Bang! 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 The serpentine lizard was bombarded by several spells. Its body was charred and bloody, and many of its scales had been split open. The barrage shaved 160 points off its health and left it at death's door. It simply lacked that one final nudge. Yet even in its death throes, the lizard did not give up and revealed its final card. It suddenly spat out a peculiar mist which, unlike the previous times, was far denser and pitch-black in color. It rapidly expanded and encompassed everything within a 20-meter radius, completely obscuring everyone's vision. Su Yan, White Smoke, and the other mages had hastily retreated when the mist began to expand. While Eternal Sin, who was at the epicenter of the skill, missed his attack and saw the shadow of the lizard bolt away. The sudden change took him by surprise, causing him to be dazed for a brief moment before realizing what was going on. Over there. It's trying to escape.
Eternal Sin roared.
This was the first time they had come across a sub-elite that ran away when at low health. However, it didn't mean they had never heard of them. Several elite-class field bosses would also use a skill to try and flee after falling below a certain health. Where? Asked one of the mages. Under the cover of the mist, their vision was completely blocked and it was impossible for them to find their target. Su Yan suddenly saw a shadow flash past some bushes. She raised her staff and prepared to cast a spell. Just as she spoke the first syllable to the incantation, "System, target is outside of spell range." She helplessly cancelled the incantation. By the time the mist dissipated, any traces of the serpentine lizard would have long disappeared. It escaped. Su Yan lowered her staff. In which direction? Eternal Sin asked. They had poured enormous amounts of effort into getting the serpentine lizard's health bar to barely a sliver of health. If it escaped just like that, wouldn't that mean all their hard work had gone to waste? Over there. At an earlier point in time, as Nie Yan silently observed the battle from the slope, a black mist emerged and covered his view, causing his heart to jump in excitement. It's about to make a break for it. Just as he expected, from within the mist, he saw a shadow escaping towards the southeast. The reason he didn't entirely leave the area was because he had known the serpentine lizard would try and escape. So, he camped out atop this slope in order to cut off its escape. The low-health serpentine lizard wouldn't be able to run too far, around 800 meters at most. He planned to kill it before Eternal Sin and his team arrived and snatched the dropped items for himself. He pondered for a moment, calculating the most optimal route, then bolted down the slope towards the nearest path and rushed to intercept the serpentine lizard. There was an old line from a poem, "Making a beautiful dress only to give to others." The line held a deeper meaning. It referred to others who, despite working hard and toiling for hours, gained no benefits and had instead given it to others. This would be an accurate portrayal of Eternal Sin and his team. Nie Yan activated a basic haste scroll and ran like the wind as he traversed the marsh. The marsh was full of wandering marsh monitors. Therefore, he inevitably ran past quite a few of them, who would aggro onto him and chase. Though in the end, he was too fast for them and quickly broke away. After a while, they would de-aggro and resume roaming around. After traveling for a while, he heard explosions in the distance and wrinkled his brows. There are others in this area? As he drew closer, the figures of another group of players entered his sights. There were 6 of them in total, and they appeared to be training in the marsh. However, he didn't slow down and soon entered their sights. Seeing him approach, the group eyed him suspiciously. "It's a thief. Everyone, be careful." All 6 players raised their guards. "He's probably just passing by," the leader of the group said. If this thief really wanted to ambush them, he wouldn't have emerged in front of them and exposed himself in plain sight. "I think he's just aggroing monsters for his team." These 6 players remained prudent and didn't take the initiative to intercept him. If by chance, this thief belonged to a team and they barred his way, it would bring them unnecessary trouble. Nie Yan had more important fish to fry, so he didn't want to get in a tangle with these players unnecessarily. Plus, they didn't pose much of a threat. He ran past them and disappeared within the thickets. Those 6 players were astonished by his speed as he dashed past them. He had closed the distance between them in almost an instant. What kind of speed is that? That thief was simply too fast. Even if they had tried to intercept him, not only would they likely fail to stop him, they would have probably ended up worse for wear as well. These 6 players felt like they dodged a bullet. Forget it, let's go back to leveling. "Hey Wong, forgotten. Do you have any more health potions? I ran out. Share some with me." The The thief's unexpected appearance was just a minor incident for them, so they quickly went back to training. As Nie Yan traveled further through the marsh, he finally began finding traces of the serpentine lizard. Finally found you. So I just need to keep going this way. He accelerated his pace. There were too many players in this area, and he didn't want the serpentine lizard falling into another person's hands. After running several dozen meters, he caught sight of the serpentine lizard resting behind some bushes. Likewise, the serpentine lizard noticed him as well. Its scarlet tongue flickered in, hissing as it watched him attentively. Like a lamp that had spent the last of its oil, there was no more strength left in its body. The final sprint had put it in a weakened state. By now, it no longer had the ability to flee. Nie Yan retrieved his crossbow, took aim, and fired at whoosh. 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 3 bolts went flying through the air. -17. -18. -16. The serpentine lizard let out a mournful cry as it writhed in pain. Nie Yan put away the crossbow, retrieved his daggers, then dashed toward it and dealt the final blow. -51. A bright red damage value rose above the lizard's head. It struggled briefly before going limp and collapsing on the ground. I saw it running over this way. Look, I see its footprints on the ground. The several voices belonged to Eternal Sin and his teammates. However, they had arrived too late. Nie Yan stooped down to the ground and picked up the item that dropped from the serpentine lizard's corpse. It's a skill book. After passing through some thickets, Eternal Sin and his team finally arrived and almost immediately noticed his presence. It's that thief! Stop him! A spell came flying straight towards him. Goodbye, he faintly smiled and gazed at Eternal Sin, Candy, and the others before bounding over the shrubbery and disappearing from their sight. Eternal Sin and his team anxiously went in pursuit, but by the time they arrived at the lizard's corpse, all signs of Nie Yan had long disappeared. They turned to look at each other and saw the similarly dismayed expression in their teammates' eyes. It took them an enormous amount of effort to get the serpentine lizard to low health. Yet somehow, it still ended up in that thief's hands. Could it be that he had never left the area and was waiting for another opportunity to appear the whole time? If that was the case, he must have possessed a terrifying level of patience. Chapter 76. Ancient City of Sulgata. This time around, the final victor of the battle was Nie Yan. As for Eternal Sin, Candy and the rest of their team, they had played all their cards already. Besides holding a grudge, there was nothing they could do. After fleeing from Eternal Sin and his team, Nie Yan resumed his main objective and headed for the ruins of Sulgata. As he ran towards his destination, he retrieved the skill book that he had obtained from the serpentine lizard from his bag. Since he had been in a hurry to escape, he hadn't checked to see what it actually was. Damn it! It's just a revive skill book. He couldn't help letting out a sigh. Though, in truth, his luck wasn't actually bad. This skill book was a vital necessity for teams if they wanted to progress in the future, and the sooner they obtained it, the better. Due to this, the current market price was ludicrous. Even if a player listed it for 1 gold, there would still be plenty of teams making a mad scramble to obtain it. Skill book. Revive. Description. Allows a priest to revive a fallen comrade. Requirements. Incantation, gesture, and material. Properties. Revive a fallen comrade. Can only be cast while outside of combat. This skill requires 10 seconds to channel. Cooldown. 30 seconds. Restrictions. Priest. Can only be learned by a member of the righteous faction. He skimmed through its description before storing it back into his bag. It would become quite valuable to him in the future, so he didn't plan on selling it. Besides, he wasn't short on money either. After traversing through a vast stretch of thickets, he eventually encountered a ruined city constructed at the center of the marshland. As he approached the city's perimeter, his gaze fell on the once towering walls that had been eroded by the elements. Upon closer inspection, he could still see traces of its former majesty. Looming past the walls stood an imposing pyramid constructed out of stone slabs, placed at the city center. Even from afar, he could see various characters from the Dark Era carved on each slab, every single one of them radiating an ancient aura. This ancient stronghold experienced countless battles and wars. No one knew what year or what month it happened, but the city had long since been devoid of life. All that remained were the aged pillars and walls that whistled a lonely ballad as the wind passed through them. No mistake, I've found the right place. Nie Yan circled the outer perimeter of the city for some time until he found the main gates. He sorted out his inventory before setting foot inside the city gates. As he crossed the threshold from the gates into the passageway, he was met with the sight of countless ruins. Moreover, the instant he entered the walls, the sky suddenly turned dark. It was almost like he had been transported into another dimension. Darkness enshrouded everything, and he could no longer see outside the city. There was only the eerie sight of the ancient ruins in front of him. System, you've discovered the Sulgata Rampart. He saw rows upon rows of dilapidated buildings that led to the giant pyramid off in the distance. As he peered through the passageway at the main road, he saw the ghastly bones of the dead littering the pathways, streets, and sidewalks. Suddenly, he felt a cold chill assault the back of his neck. A cold wind blew, and the scattered bones began moving on their own. Seeing this, he hurriedly climbed to a higher vantage point. Shortly after reaching a reasonable height, the countless bones of varying sizes began to assemble together. There were some of short stature, seemingly belonging to dwarves. Another group looked almost reptilian in nature, if you ignored the enormous bony wings that were growing out of their backs. Presumably, these belonged to the dragon race. The rest belonged to the human and giant races. These undead were what remained of an ancient battle. Countless lives belonging to various races were lost inside this stronghold. Their souls couldn't move on to the afterlife, so they persisted through the ages and lingered by their remains. As soon as they sensed the breath of the living, they would reanimate their bodies and seek to exterminate its source without fail. Nie Yan scanned over the nearest ones using transcendent insight. Skeleton Sentinel, extremely frail level 10. Health, 120/120. Skeleton Mage, extremely frail level 10. Health, 80/80ths. Skeleton Ripper, extremely frail level 10. Health, 150/150. The skeletons had small health pools, and their attacks weren't powerful. In addition, they possessed the extremely frail modifier, so the level disparity between him and the mobs could be ignored. Even so, their sheer numbers couldn't be underestimated. The entire passageway was filled to the brim with skeletons. Moreover, since they were undead, they couldn't bleed nor be stunned. Stealth was also useless against them since they detected the living through the presence of life, not sight. He hurriedly distanced himself from these undead. If they discovered him, they would charge over in a rush to exterminate him. After putting some space between them, he slowly made his way forward. Eventually, he encountered a lone skeleton sentinel. He unsheathed his daggers and dashed in. Opening with an assassinate, he then followed up with Vital Strike and instantly smashed it into smithereens. System, you've successfully slain a skeleton sentinel. Plus 200% experience for killing a monster above your level. You've received 230 experience points. Though these skeletons were relatively weak, the experience they gave was quite decent. Just as Nie Yan killed the lone skeleton sentinel, a group of skeleton sentinels and skeleton rippers from across the passage noticed his presence and bolted towards him. There were over a dozen of them running at him like an incoming wave. The skeleton rippers were the first to approach as they brandished their blades. The skeleton mages behind them raised their staffs. Crimson and pale white energy coalesced together, forming an otherworldly blaze, and a rain of ice and lightning magic followed as well. God damn it! Why are there so many of them? He inwardly cried. After a quick glance behind him, he discovered the exit had been sealed off as well. There were skeletons everywhere. He fled from the fight and dashed toward a fork in the path. Although their numbers were great, their movements were clumsy and awkward. Thus, if he didn't act carelessly, they wouldn't pose too much of a threat to him. Bang! 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 Several spells exploded by his side as he dashed around the corner and escaped the skeleton mage's attack range. As he fled from the skeletons, he observed the path ahead of him and noticed another mob of enemies aggressively charging in his direction. He couldn't retreat since the rear path was sealed off by skeletons, and he couldn't advance into the charging skeletons. Nie Yan quickly looked at the walls beside him. They were roughly 5 meters high, and littered with footholds due to their eroded state. He leapt into the air and scaled the walls. After reaching the top, he gently landed on the other side. There were several skeleton mages scattered around the vicinity of this path. In addition, many bones littered the ground, seemingly yet to reanimate. He didn't dare to be neglectful and dashed towards one of the skeleton mages with his daggers raised. After a brief exchange, the skeleton mage collapsed to the ground and shattered into fragments. The other skeleton mages had already noticed his presence and were in the middle of casting their spells. However, he was lightning fast and quickly finished them off one by one. Afterward, as he began picking up the items that dropped, the bones on the ground trembled and began reassembling themselves. He didn't stay any longer and promptly fled towards the exit. However, as his feet stepped past a few tiles on the floor, he felt a slight vibration beneath his feet. Though it had been extremely minute, he still detected it immediately. Traps. He hastily jumped to the side. Boom. The tile he had stepped on exploded, sending debris flying everywhere. Several of the nearby skeletons had been caught by the explosion and were blown away. The shock from the blast destroyed them as they collapsed into a pile of bone fragments. Some of the shrapnel from the explosion also struck his body and caused several damage values to rise above his head. -12. -13. -15. He broke out in a cold sweat as he lay sprawled on the ground. These landmines were extremely terrifying. If he had taken the full brunt of that explosion, he wouldn't have even left a complete corpse behind. Although the landmines were dangerous, with a single explosion being able to instantly kill a thief, there was a slight 2-second window before they actually detonated. As long as he maintained his awareness, he could pass through safely without a hitch. Chapter 77. Cursed Skull. Nie Yan climbed back to his feet and dashed toward his destination, clearing out the skeletons as he traveled along the narrow, twisting passages of the Salgada rampart. After clearing out several passages and finishing off the last nearby skeleton mage, his experience bar had risen by 2%. Along the way he had picked up many items, though he still hadn't had the time to sort them out yet. As he advanced onwards, he eventually encountered an area with no skeletal remains. Finally! This ought to be a safe area. He sat down and began sorting through the items he had recently picked up, 27 coppers and 2 subpar pieces of bronze equipment. Just as he was about to close his inventory menu, a shabby-looking scroll at the bottom corner of the window caught his eye. Only then did he recall that he had obtained such an item. He must have picked it up from that skeleton mage he destroyed earlier. Written on this yellowed scroll were the ancient characters of the dragon race. It read, "Ancient spirits awaken from within the shadows." It was a special one-use item called a spirit summoning scroll. As the name suggests, the player could summon an ancient spirit by activating this scroll. However, there were downsides. In the event that the player failed to control the spirit, they would be devoured in turn. It was quite an uncommon item. In Salgada, the likelihood of it dropping was 1 in 2,000. So, if one were lucky, they'd obtain it every so often while killing skeletons in the area. The ghost summoned by this item wasn't all that strong. At best, it could be used as a meat shield. However, in an area like Salgada that was filled with countless roaming skeletons, this item was surprisingly handy. Though, there was a slight problem. His low level would make it difficult for him to control the summoned ghost, which meant that it was highly possible it would try to devour him. Should I use it or not? Nie Yan pondered for a moment. If I'm capable of controlling it, then I'll have a meat shield at my disposal. If I fail, however, my only loss will be a scroll. With those thoughts in mind, he turned and surveyed his surroundings. It's pretty spacious here, and for the time being, there won't be any monsters to disturb me. After thinking for a bit, he bit into his thumb and pressed it onto the scroll, using his blood to draw a dark red mark. As his blood gradually seeped into its fibers, the scroll began to radiate with a faint glow. The ancient seals written on the scroll were slowly beginning to activate. Soon, a dark, ghastly energy emerged from the scroll and gradually condensed into the form of a person. The spirit he summoned was a ghost assassin. It appeared translucent and held a shadowy dagger in its hands. Ghost Assassin. Level 10. Health. 230/230. Its stats actually weren't bad for a level 10 summon. In his previous timeline, he had also used this item when he was level 10 or so. In those days, the price of a spirit summoning scroll was about 8 silvers, which wasn't considered to be very expensive as the average player was able to buy them. If he were to sell the scroll at the marketplace now, then considering its current rarity, it would probably go for around 10 silvers. The Ghost Assassin's combat strength was decent, and it had a summon duration of 30 minutes. It also possessed 3 skills: Shroud, Concussive Blow, and Self-Detonate. With this summon at his side, his leveling speed would certainly increase significantly. After being summoned, the Ghost Assassin didn't move at all. Instead, it scanned the surroundings with its cold eyes. Nie Yan attempted to control the ghost, but it didn't budge an inch. He tried once more, and this time, it actually moved. I succeeded. His heart filled with pleasant surprise. With the Ghost Assassin by his side, he'd have an extra hand to help fight the skeletons. Contrary to his expectations, however, the Ghost Assassin's dagger flashed with a cold glint as it suddenly dashed toward him. Shit, this asshole is trying to devour me. This wasn't entirely unexpected though, as he never had high hopes to begin with when he summoned it. His level was simply too low. Moreover, the ghost wasn't merely a level or 2 above him, it was 5 entire levels above him. Controlling it couldn't have been an easy matter. In the event that the player failed to control the summon creature, they would be the first thing the summon would aggro onto. As it sped toward him, Nie Yan rapidly pulled back and dodged the Ghost Assassin's oncoming attack. Then, seeing an opening, he quickly pounced forward and went on the offensive. Vital Strike! Nie Yan shouted out as he slashed his dagger across the Ghost Assassin's neck. Yet, the attack seemed to be ineffective as its shadowy neck simply restored itself almost instantly after being cut. Brandishing the dagger in its hand, that ghastly being dashed forward and answered with an attack of its own. Nie Yan was forced back onto the defensive and had to constantly retreat as they fought. Their positions were ever changing as they moved about the area. This ghost was much stronger than those frail skeletons. Thankfully, he had only summoned a Ghost Assassin and not something tankier. So although he was 5 levels below it, his damage wasn't insignificant. -23. -25. 2 damage values rose above the Ghost Assassin's head. After losing a sizable chunk of health, the ghost's body began to sway and fade, eventually disappearing from sight. Nie Yan had lost sight of his target. No matter how hard he concentrated while searching, he was unable to detect its position. The level discrepancy between them was just too large, so he was unable to see through the Ghost Assassin's shroud. He cautiously retreated to a nearby wall, then pressed his back against the stone so he would only have to face attacks from the front. Suddenly, the nearby shadows flickered and a silhouette emerged at his side. The dagger in its hands deftly struck towards his head. The Ghost Assassin was also capable of using Concussive Blow, and Nie Yan was a goner if he let himself get stunned. Seeing the dagger approach, he quickly sidestepped the attack and avoided a perilous situation. But just as he dodged the attack, the Ghost Assassin turned its blade back and lashed out at Nie Yan again, though this time, its dagger transformed into 3 flashes of light before it struck. -52, -57, -56. The unexpected chain of attacks cost him the greater half of his health. Nie Yan hurriedly pulled back, just narrowly evading the Ghost Assassin's second flurry of attacks, then leapt away to put some distance between them. He took out a basic health potion and poured its contents down his throat, instantly restoring 30 health. Seeing the Ghost Assassin draw near, Nie Yan swung out his right arm and attempted to hit it in the head with a concussive blow. The Ghost Assassin's head split in 2 from the force of the strike, but rapidly began recovering to its original shape. While its head recovered, the ghost halted its movements for several seconds. And those few seconds were all Nie Yan needed to unload enough attacks to bring it down to a third of its health. He proved to be a bit too greedy with his attacks, though, as he continued attacking even after the stun had worn off. He didn't have time to react as the Ghost Assassin slashed at his chest. -76. A critical hit. The attack reduced his health to 13%, leaving him badly frightened. Without sparing a second, he quickly fell back with swift retreat and applied a combat bandage. +20. +20. +20. The ghost assassin had no intention to let him rest as it rushed towards him with a dagger aimed right for his head. Nie Yan dodged, rolled to the side, evading the attack, then swiftly retaliated with assassinate. His dagger slashed across the ghost assassin's chest. His attack also dealt a critical hit and brought the ghost assassin down to 5% health. The ghost assassin suddenly let out a cry as its body turned a dark shade of red and began to rapidly expand and violently surge with energy. It wants to self-destruct. The explosion from a ghost assassin self-destructing was especially terrifying. He had been caught in such an explosion before in his past, and it caused him to lose over 80% of his health. But that was when he was level 10. As a level 5, he probably wouldn't even be left with a complete corpse. Judging that it was too late to escape the blast radius, he rushed at the ghost assassin and planted his dagger in its throat. Vital strike. The ghost assassin's health fell to 0, and its self-detonate was cancelled. As it dissolved into thin air, it let out a single mournful cry. Ha! 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 Nie Yan gasped for air. That bastard was more difficult than I thought. As he recovered his stamina, his eyes happened to glance over the ground. It actually dropped something. Although the ghost assassin was a summon, as soon as it broke away from the summoner's control, it would become indistinguishable from common mobs. This meant that it could drop items upon death like any other mob. Nie Yan bent down and grasped the item that had dropped. Upon further inspection, it appeared to be a skull that was roughly the size of his palm. Numerous delicate patterns and designs were carved onto the top of the skull, and there were even 2 green gems embedded in its sockets. Cursed Skull. Fate Item. Chapter 78. Fat dice. Fate items were spread by the powers of the Chaos faction. They were extremely rare items and often possessed unimaginable effects. This information came from the dark region known as the Underworld, an area filled with pestilence and blight. There, countless creatures roamed amongst the lands dotted with ancient tombs. In addition to that, the land was also where the undead flourished, being home to wraiths, skeletons, ghouls, and all other sorts of dark entities. Aside from evil necromancers, who beckoned the unliving with their magic, no others could approach this land. The Spirit Summoning Scroll was an item used to bypass countless layers of earth and summon spiritual entities directly from the underworld, most of which had never seen the light of day. Some fate items served as catalysts for necromancers to summon spirits, while others were dark items that contained powerful curses. Though no matter what their use was, not even necromancers were fully capable of controlling these items as they desired. Just like their name suggested, the outcome of using a fate item could only be left up to fate. Nie Yan read over the Cursed Skull's description. In order to activate its effect, the player was required to crush the skull, whereupon 3 fate dice would be summoned. Once activated, there was no turning back. The player must roll each die, otherwise they would be cursed. If a 4 or higher was rolled, then the player would receive a reward. If the player rolled a 3 or lower, however, they would be inflicted with a curse based on the result. The lower the roll, the heavier the penalty. Inversely, the higher the roll, the greater the reward. Be it a reward or a curse, opportunity and risk were 2 sides of the same coin. Additionally, the Cursed Skull would disappear if it wasn't used within 5 minutes. After he finished reading the description, Nie Yan felt an indescribable sensation in his chest. The outcome of using this item was hard to predict. This was because the summon dice were rolled by the system, which meant it was impossible to cheat, and thus the end result depended entirely on luck. This meant each roll had a 50% chance to be a boon and an equal chance to be a curse. Nie Yan calmly sat on the ground and started eating a loaf of bread to replenish his health, though his state of mind was anything but tranquil. Gah! It all depends on my luck. Even he couldn't say for sure whether his luck was good or bad. While pondering about what his next action would be, Nie Yan closely examined the skull in the palm of his hands. The skull had a gem embedded in each eye, and they were flickering with a ghastly light. As he stared into the eyes, he felt as though they were staring back, watching him. It was calling to him, telling him that it was simply providing him an opportunity. As for whether he dared to challenge fate, that choice was solely up to him. The future was filled with uncertainty. Nie Yan firmly grasped the skull in his hand, despite still being entirely hesitant about what he should do. If he delayed his choice any longer, then the fate item would vanish without a trace. He endlessly questioned himself to the point of torture. In such a situation, no one would dare make a rash decision. As the minutes and seconds continued to pass by, he suddenly recalled an old folktale in the game. It was about an old man who arrived in a village carrying a sealed chest. The old man entered the village square and told the residents that he would unlock the chest and give all the contents within it to whomever paid him a silver. Yet in the end, not even a single villager was willing to spend the money for the chest. Eventually, the old man left. However, from then on the residents of that village would often lose sleep as they tossed and turned in bed, recalling the old man and his mysterious chest. They regretted not paying the silver and getting to the bottom of that chest. The moral of the story was quite simple, and it applied to his current situation rather well. If he didn't use this cursed skull and let it fade away, then perhaps he would end up like those villagers, endlessly thinking back to one event with regret. There's no harm in trying my luck. Nie Yan firmed his resolve and gradually exerted more strength on the skull in his right hand. Crack. It began to split under the pressure as he gritted his teeth. Pop. The cursed skull was crushed into pieces. The next 20 seconds passed in complete silence, as if everything in the vicinity had been frozen in time. Suddenly, an enormous bone-white, six-sided fate die emerged in the sky, suspended directly above Nie Yan. Each face had a different number carved into it. 1 to 6 appeared in ancient, crimson-red characters belonging to the spirit race. It awaited his attempt to challenge fate. After taking in a deep breath, Nie Yan slowly extended his right arm. As his hand hovered over one of the floating die, it began to spin at an incredible speed, with a number facing him changing at a rapid pace. The scene was easily capable of making a person's head spin from dizziness. Stop! As soon as he called out, the rapidly spinning fate die immediately came to a rest, and the number was revealed before him. The bolded character was in a shade of red that resembled blood. Shit. I'm out of luck. Almost immediately, a sinister, malicious energy covered his entire body and slowly drained his strength. Pestilence of the frail. Your strength has been permanently reduced by 10. The terrifying curse sent chills down his spine and caused his heart to freeze over. Even if he was a top expert, losing 10 strength was still incredibly difficult to bear. Each stat point was as precious as the next. Not to mention that, outside of leveling, permanently raising a stat by even a single point was an extremely challenging task. To Nie Yan, it seemed as though the scarlet number painted on the die had transformed into the slithering tongue of a devil. Flamboyant and alluring, it gazed at him in a mocking manner. The die had only landed on a 3, yet it had permanently reduced his strength by 10 points. He had a hard time imagining what sort of severe curse he would have come under if it had landed on a 2 or even possibly a 1. Even worse, he still had 2 more rolls to go. He didn't dare think about the consequences that potentially awaited him. Would he end up a cripple? In that case, he would have to delete his character and start all over again. His fate was unknown. And because it was unknown, it was all the more terrifying to think of. However, he couldn't back out now. The next fate die was quietly floating in the air. If he didn't roll before a certain amount of time passed, he would be automatically cursed regardless. Was he regretting his decision? No. To be more accurate, he didn't have the time for regret. He hovered his right hand over the second die, causing it to rapidly spin in the air. He didn't know if the next roll was going to be a dazzling reward or a debilitating curse. Though, no matter the outcome, he was unable to escape this trial of fate. What if it's another curse? No, it definitely won't be. Stop! Nie Yan called out. The tone of his voice revealed his faltering resolve compared to earlier, but he still pressed on regardless. The ivory-white fate die was akin to a snake coiling itself around his heart. The sound of the die stopping practically caused his heart to stop beating. 5. It landed on a 5. Then, a white radiance descended over him, and he felt as though a huge weight had been lifted. It's not a curse. As long as it's not a curse, then it's okay. Nie Yan regained his calm and checked the system announcement, whereupon he immediately checked his skill window. There was an extra skill in one of the slots. Undead Rite, Undead Temple Magic. Rank 1 sacrifice 30% health for a 20% chance of controlling a targeted undead for 3 hours. The player can only control a maximum of 5 undead at one time. Cooldown 30s. Apparently, where there were sacrifices, there were also gains. When he saw undead right, he couldn't help but feel excited. It was actually temple magic. Elemental hall magic and undead temple magic were both classified as high-level skills. After losing 10 points of strength, this seemed like a reasonable return. After all, since he had the chapter of courage, it was possible to make up for the permanent loss in strength after 25 levels. In addition, this rare skill was a priceless treasure. In the future, he'd have an advantage when leveling and traversing areas filled with undead. Unfortunately, that was where the celebrations would come to an end. The last die floating in the air caused him to gaze at it with a complex expression. This item could truly allow a player to reach the heavens in a single bound. At the same time, however, it could also consign a player to the deepest layers of hell. Chapter 79, Sulgata Colosseum. Fate tended to operate in an unfathomable way. It could grant a person a short respite during their time of suffering, only to send them straight to eternal damnation afterwards. Life or death. Nobody knew for certain what fate had in store for them. If he wasn't willing to take on the risks, he wouldn't have crushed the skull in the first place. Nie Yan forcefully calmed his mind and extended his hand over the die. A bountiful reward, or a malignant curse, the final result of his gamble would remain shrouded in mystery until this final die came to a stop. The fate die began to spin and tumble in the air as his unknown fate beckoned to him. Seeing the die rotating at a dizzying speed, he broke out in a cold sweat. Please don't let it be a curse. Stop. He felt like his heart was going to explode out of his chest. The die immediately halted, and the strange demonic character revealed before his eyes was shockingly a 5. Another 5. Perhaps 5 was his lucky number. The surprising result of the final roll left Nie Yan feeling an indescribable amount of bliss. His only hope was that he wouldn't roll another curse. He never actually thought that he would receive a reward, much less what the reward might be. After all, rolling 3 fate dice wasn't something an ordinary player could afford. This extremely dangerous gamble made him feel as though his heart had been constricted from all the stress. System. You've received Pandora's box. Pandora's box. Fate item. What the hell? Another fate item. The first one had already given him enough of a headache, yet he was given a second one. If this one was just like the first and could cause him to be cursed, then he'd rather have it disappear. After experiencing the fickle nature of the fate dice, he vowed to never partake in such a terrifying gamble again. Partaking in a dangerous gamble like that just once was more than enough, so he wouldn't regret letting the second chance disappear. Pandora's box was a perfectly shaped, silver-gray cube. On each face was a different carving depicting various things such as a sinister skull, a fiendish devil, an angel, and so on. Not only were the carvings both vivid and lifelike, they were also meticulously detailed. In addition, these carvings seemed to be imbued with a peculiar energy. Nie Yan examined Pandora's box a bit more closely. Fortunately for him, it didn't fall under the same category as the cursed skull. In fact, it was actually quite the treasure. Pandora's box. Fate item. Item description. Insert 3 pieces of equipment of equal grade into Pandora's box for a 10% chance of obtaining a piece of equipment of a higher grade. All pieces of equipment are destroyed upon failure. Insert a piece of equipment and a fortune gem for a chance of raising its grade by 1. Upon failure, the piece of equipment is demoted by a grade. Counter, cycle equals 3 seconds. Begins when activated. If cycle number is even, luck plus 5. If cycle is odd, luck minus 5. User restriction. Can be used by all factions. This item was actually quite a rarity. Although he had heard of such an item in the past, Nie Yan had never actually come across one himself. In addition, it didn't lose out 1 bit to legendary grade equipment in value. He could put 3 pieces of gold equipment inside Pandora's box for a 10% chance of getting a piece of dark gold equipment in return. Of course, there was a 90% chance of failure as well, which meant the loss of all the items he had inserted, but the potential return was well worth the risk. For example, if he inserted 3 pieces of dark gold equipment into the box, he had a chance of obtaining a piece of sub-legendary equipment. The slight caveat was that very few players would actually dare to stake 3 pieces of dark gold equipment on such a gamble. After all, equipment of that rarity was extremely expensive and hard to obtain. The second method allowed the player to raise the grade of their equipment by using fortune gems. These gems were expensive items created by jewel crafters that increased the success rate of inserting gems into equipment sockets. Usually their market price averaged around 5 silvers, but the real challenge was actually finding them being listed up for sale. Moreover, most of those who bought these gems couldn't bear to actually use them. The item's ability to affect luck was also very useful. It could influence the drop rate, crafting success rate, etc. 5 points might not sound like much, but it was actually quite a significant amount of luck. It could increase the drop rate when killing monsters by 200%, crafting success rate by 1/5, and so on. As for the inverse, when the player's luck was reduced by 5 points. Let's just say that, at that point, anything that could go wrong was guaranteed to go wrong. This item would basically divide the player's time into 2 periods. One where they would be the luckiest man in the world, and one where they would be the most unfortunate soul in existence. Nie Yan pondered for a moment. It wasn't necessarily a lucky item, but he could try his best to trigger events when the timer was on an even cycle. Even though 3 seconds passed by in the blink of an eye, he was confident he would be able to gauge the timing properly. This blessing had arrived so abruptly that he had yet to figure out what item grade Pandora's box belonged to. This was quite the conundrum, one he'd certainly need to slowly research lest he miss any details. But that was a task for the future. Right now he needed to get moving. After standing up, Nie Yan stored Pandora's box away in his bag. It seemed that in this gamble, the risks had brought more reward than punishment. Realizing that he was one step closer to understanding one of the many mysteries of fate, Nie Yan felt his heartbeat fluctuate. As soon as the fate dice disappeared, time in the area seemed to start moving again. The frozen skeletons in the distance resumed their movements and once again began closing in with the intent of surrounding him. Many skeletons who had seen Nie Yan while patrolling the area attempted to get closer to him, but upon drawing near, they simply stopped in their tracks. It wasn't until the fate dice disappeared that they finally resumed their pursuit. Because of this, a large mob of skeletons had gradually built up nearby. When Nie Yan looked over, he saw them packed tighter than sardines in a tin can. So many skeletons! Nie Yan didn't dare stay here any longer and hastily fled towards a nearby wall. The outer district of Sulgata resembled an immense labyrinth. He didn't even know his own location. He was simply relying on his own judgment as he moved towards the gigantic pyramid that stood at the center of the city. While navigating the city, the distant pyramid made for a convenient landmark. The skeletons didn't stop their pursuit. As soon as the skeleton mages got within range, they raised their staffs and rained magic down upon his location. Nie Yan leaped into the air, and just as he set foot on top of the wall, boom, boom, boom. The volley of spells battered the wall and sent a large amount of debris flying everywhere. 2-1, 2-7, 2-5. Numerous damage values rose above Nie Yan's head, bringing his health down to 1/3 after only a single round of spells. There were just too many skeleton mages below him. After drinking a health potion, he jumped down to the other side. His landing was graceful, but that didn't mean he was out of danger yet. The only way Nie Yan saw to shake off the skeletons was to deviate from his current path, which would bring him further and further from the pyramid at the center. However, he had no other choice. He had to lose the skeletons that were pursuing him. Nie Yan eventually came across an opening that seemed to lead to one of the city's public squares. Even further off in the distance, he was able to make out a coliseum. It must have surely been an imposing sight back in its prime, but now it was nothing more than ruins, surely the work of several centuries of erosion. Even though it was now in ruins, when Nie Yan stared at the dilapidated relic from a long-gone era, he was still able to imagine how it would have looked in the past. System: you've discovered Sulgata Coliseum. So it was the city's Coliseum. Nie Yan had been through this area in the past, but he never actually took the time to look around and explore this Coliseum. While making his way through the plaza, Nie Yan suddenly felt something give underneath his foot. It's a pitfall. He had been too distracted by the imposing sight of the Colosseum in the distance, and didn't bother to examine the area for traps. Thus, in his carelessness, he ended up stepping right into a trap. Nie Yan suddenly leapt forward in an attempt to jump away before the ground beneath him completely collapsed. To his shock, however, he discovered that the pitfall trap he had stumbled into was gigantic. It spanned over 20 meters wide. How could he possibly leap that far away? Before he could get away, the ground collapsed, sending Nie Yan into a free fall. He didn't know how deep the pitfall was, so he readied his featherfall gem. If the pitfall was too high, he'd have no choice but to use it to prevent himself from dying from fall damage. Thud! However, those worries seemed to be unnecessary as he landed on the ground and only at 26 rows above his head. It seemed the pitfall wasn't too deep, only around 10 meters at most. Chapter 80. Controlling the Undead. Nie Yan had fallen into a square room surrounded by prison cells. Above him hung several night pearls which illuminated the area below. As he took a good look at his surroundings, he then realized just what kind of place he had fallen into. He was likely dropped into an underground dungeon. On either side of him were two enclosures with stout metal bars which firmly prevented escape. As he peered through the gaps and into the enclosures, he saw a gigantic set of bones in each one. The bone piles reached roughly 4 meters in height, and he could see enormous tails, skeletal wings, and lizard-like skulls mixed in. These two skeletal remains had most likely been dragons when they were alive. Since this dungeon wasn't too far from the Salgata Colosseum, it seemed these dragons were forced to fight in the gladiatorial arena. As prisoners of the Colosseum, all of their freedoms were wrested away, and they were made into tools of entertainment for the nobility. When Salgata finally fell, they were most likely abandoned and kept locked in their cells, left to starve, and eventually turning into skeletons. While Nie Yan was lost in thought, the two bone piles suddenly trembled and slowly began to reassemble. Roar! Roar! The two skeletons let out indignant cries which reverberated across the entire dungeon. They resembled two vicious beasts as they charged at Nie Yan. Bang! The iron bars of their cells violently shuddered after being rammed by their large skeletal frames. Their cages slightly contorted as the bars had been bent askew from the collisions. The skeletal dragons cried out furiously as they repeatedly slammed into their enclosure, causing the metal bars to warp just a little more each time. Nie Yan felt their cages wouldn't be able to hold on much longer due to the continuous impacts. These dragons probably held great resentment and vexation during their passing. Thus, their souls were unable to move on, and they became undead. They were much stronger than ordinary undead, and their dark red bones possessed a metallic luster. Nie Yan used transcendent insight to examine these skeletal dragons. Undead Dragon Gladiator. Leader Level 10. Health 600/600. They were leader class monsters, and they shared a common trait among most skeletal undead. Their healths were much lower in comparison to their living counterparts. Even then, these two level 10 leader class monsters still weren't something he could handle. The undead dragons could easily kill him. He glanced at the walls of the pitfall above him. It was too high. It would be impossible for him to climb out of it, even with the aid of the silk spinner ring. As he looked around for somewhere to escape, his eyes happened to fall on a tunnel in the distance that appeared to be the dungeon's exit. However, the tunnel was sealed off by an iron gate. The gate was firmly clamped shut by a giant padlock. He didn't have any thoughts of smashing the gate open, it simply wasn't possible. He wasn't like those undead dragons who possessed large bodies and robust frames. After the repeated collisions from the undead dragons, many metals bars were visibly damaged and bent out of shape. The cages were becoming increasingly weaker with every passing second, and eventually, they collapsed, freeing the skeletal dragons as they charged towards Nie Yan. Simultaneously facing off against two level 10 leader class monsters in such a confined space would result in his untimely demise. The two large skeletal frames came barreling towards him from the sky. They possessed bones even stronger than metal, a powerful body that was full of strength, and a giant tail covered in bony spikes. No matter what he did, it would be impossible to defeat them. It was hopeless to try and fight them directly. Thus, he quickly scanned his eyes over his skill bar. He could only entrust his life into this final hope undead rite. This skill was the only thing that could save him since it had a 20% chance of controlling a targeted undead. Whether he lived or died all depended on this skill succeeding. Due to the level disparity between him and the undead dragon, he wasn't sure he'd succeed in controlling it. In the same instant the skeletal dragons neared, Nie Yan activated the skill and targeted one of them. Undead Rite. System. You've targeted Undead Dragon Gladiator with Undead Rite. Your health has been reduced by 30%. System. Undead Rite has failed. As soon as he read the system notification, Nie Yan activated Swift Retreat and rolled out of the way. A giant tail whipped towards where he had just been standing. Boom. Clouds of dust rose into the air, and large cracks were left on the ground where the tail had struck. Since the two dragons had charged at him at the same time, one of them ended up ramming the other, so they were both sent staggering several steps back due to the impact. Taking advantage of this brief window, Nie Yan activated Undead Rite once again, though the attempt was shortly followed by an announcement of the spell's failure. Thus, before the dragons recovered from the collision, he rolled past their legs. Managing to stabilize himself with some difficulty, he then fled to the nearest corner. Not only did the undead dragons miss with their attacks, they lost track of their target as well. Ghastly green flames flickered in their eye sockets as they searched for Nie Yan's whereabouts, eventually finding him hidden in the corner. Shortly after discovering Nie Yan, one of the skeletal dragons lifted its leg and attempted to crush him. Nie Yan hastily ducked out of the way. Boom! The stomp left a deep imprint in the floor. Following the first one's attack, the other skeletal dragon attempted to stomp him as well. He was frightened half to death as he continuously evaded their attacks. Fortunately for him, the narrow passages of this dungeon further limited the movements of the already clumsy undead, and since their attacks were relatively slow, he was able to barely hang on to his life. However, if this battle continued to drag on at its current pace, he would probably end up dead regardless. Undead Rite. System. You've targeted Undead Dragon Gladiator with Undead Rite. Your health has been reduced by 30%. System. Undead Rite has failed. Now that Undead Rite had failed 3 times in a row, Nie Yan only had 1/10 of his health remaining. While evading the attacks, he pulled out a basic recovery potion, downed its contents, and then applied a combat bandage to himself. After evading the skeletal dragon's attacks for several breaths of time, Nie Yan cast Undead Rite once again when his health bar recovered to 52%. In the same moment, the two skeletal dragons attacked. System. Undead Rite has succeeded. Shortly after the system announcement appeared, Nie Yan felt a strange energy being birthed in his mind. The energy rose above his head and shot straight at one of the skeletal dragons, disappearing into its body. With Undead Rite succeeding, Nie Yan rolled out of the way and evaded the oncoming dragons. Boom! The dragons missed their target and rammed into each other, the impact stunning both and sending them staggering several steps back. In the meantime, Nie Yan hid in a corner and attentively gazed at the dragon he had taken control of using Undead Rite. Did I actually succeed? What's the result? Nie Yan didn't have high expectations in successfully controlling the undead dragon due to the level disparity between them. Thus, despite the announcement, he didn't dare to confirm if he had truly succeeded. This was possibly his last chance at survival. If he missed this opportunity, there would be no more. 2 skeletal dragons and Nie Yan formed a triangle as they stood in this narrow underground dungeon. However, at this moment, the 2 dragons were staring at each other. Time seemed to flow in reverse, returning Sulgata to its prime. When beasts and gladiators fought in the barbarous Colosseum, blood splattered everywhere, painting a vibrant scenery of crimson red. The dragon who had been targeted by Undead Rite stood there blankly, staring out into space. The ghastly flames in its eyes seemed to be affected by some sort of foreign energy. Boom! Boom! It slightly shook about as if trying to break free of the fetters binding it. Please, God. Please let it succeed. Nie Yan prayed for the skill to succeed. In reality, he was an atheist and didn't actually believe in God or any divine deities. However, there was a certain entity in Conviction God of Light that could be considered God, and at this point in time, he became a devout and pious follower. The other dragon suddenly took action and leapt at Nie Yan. It pressed toward him and aimed to end his life. Just as the skeletal dragon leaped into the air, the other dragon, who had been targeted by undead right prior, rammed into its side to boom. The two dragons collided again, and the one that was attacking Nie Yan was sent flying. Perhaps some divine existence took pity on Nie Yan and answered his prayers because undead right had unexpectedly succeeded in controlling the dragon just in the nick of time. Under the effects of undead right, a glowing black aura emerged over the dark reddish hues of the skeletal dragon's bones, transforming it into a huge metallic beast that brimmed with berserk power. System: set a name for your new servant. Nie Yan thought for a moment and decided to name this dragon Dark Gladiator. It seemed appropriate, considering its appearance. After being successfully controlled by undead right, Dark Gladiator's stats rose by 10%. The already formidable skeletal dragon had become even more of a matchless powerhouse. Its only weak point was it could only act as a temporary companion and only lasted for 3 hours, whereupon its soul would be consumed by undead right. It was hard to imagine that someone could possess control over such a terrifying monster. Chapter 81. Dark Gladiator. Dark Gladiator relentlessly attacked the other skeletal dragon and flung it across the underground dungeon, smashing it heavily into the walls. Boom! 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 The sound of thunderous strikes reverberated through the air as the skeletal dragon was battered left and right across the dungeon. Amidst the relentless assault, the skeletal dragon found an opening and retaliated, whipping its tail at Dark Gladiator's chest. Boom! The force of the attack forced Dark Gladiator several steps back. However, Dark Gladiator seemed virtually unaffected as it resumed its assault and rushed at the skeletal dragon again. As the fighting intensified, Dark Gladiator and the undead dragon resembled two ancient behemoths in a life-and-death struggle. While the two dragons fought, Nie Yan retrieved his crossbow of blood from his inventory and adeptly loaded it with the black gold bolts that dealt on-hit true damage. Propping the crossbow to his chest, he aligned the sights on his target and fired. Whoosh! 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 The bolt struck the skeletal dragon, causing 3 damage values to rise above its head. Although the damage wasn't ludicrously high, it was still significant. At the minimum, the bolts dealt 30 to 40 points in combined damage. In one instance, an armor break occurred, and Nie Yan was able to deal upwards of 100 damage. The two dragons were engaged in an all-out brawl, and despite the hectic battle, Nie Yan was still able to fire at the other skeletal dragon with pinpoint accuracy. Nie Yan felt it was quite unfortunate that it took him 4 attempts to control one of the skeletal dragons using undead right. Moreover, in order to cast it the 4th time, he had been forced to use all of his recovery items to replenish his depleted health as quickly as possible. He glanced at his remaining health, not even sufficient to cast another undead right. Although he felt uncomfortable with his health being so low, he could do nothing about it since his combat bandages and other health recovery items were still on cooldown. Dark Gladiator's relentless attacks and Nie Yan's continuous fire eventually brought the skeletal dragon down to critical health. He originally planned to turn this remaining skeletal dragon into his servant as well, but looking at the current situation, such an idea was no longer possible since Dark Gladiator didn't have much health remaining either. If he allowed the battle to drag on and purposefully delayed dealing the killing blow, Dark Gladiator would certainly end up being killed by the other skeletal dragon. After spending so much health obtaining one skeletal dragon, he wasn't willing to let it die without serving him to its full potential. At the 20-second mark since the battle began, Dark Gladiator lashed out with its claws and struck the other skeletal dragon in the chest, simultaneously alleviating the opponent of its remaining health. Following the other skeleton dragon's death, a ghastly ball of flame emerged from its chest and floated upward before gradually disappearing in the air. The skeleton, now a shell without an owner, shattered and loudly crashed to the floor. Jingle! Jingle! As soon as the dragon collapsed, a melodious tune rang out as a bright radiance emerged from Nie Yan's body. He had finally leveled up to level 6. He gained a sizable amount of experience for killing the level 10 undead dragon gladiator. Due to it being 5 levels above him, he received 17-fold of its base experience value. Nie Yan walked toward the bone pile and collected the items that dropped from the undead dragon. The item was surprisingly a pair of gold-grade shoulder guards, 57 to 62 defense, strength plus 13, and resilience plus 17. It was definitely a good piece of equipment. He reckoned he could sell it for quite a bit in the auction house. Let alone one that gave bonuses in strength and resilience. Even if a pair of gold-grade shoulder guards had undesirable properties, based on the raw defense they provided alone, they would still sell for a decent price. The value of this piece of equipment was only slightly lower than the Lion King's shield he planned to sell to Bladelight. No buyer should even think of taking these shoulder guards off his hands if they didn't offer at least 20 silvers. Naturally, this didn't apply to acquaintances or friends who wanted to purchase them. In that case, it would depend on how friendly he was with the person. After killing the undead dragon gladiator and reaching level 6, his experience bar filled by 13%. When he checked the player ladder, the current top rank player was a level 8. Moreover, they were a mage. In conviction, no matter how fast a thief could kill monsters, they would still never compare to a mage. Some powerful mages were even able to easily kill monsters above their levels by kiting, taking advantage of terrain, or casting high-level spells. Skilled mages could even solo kill certain bosses without taking damage, an incredibly difficult task for melee professions. Of course, these norms didn't apply to an extreme outlier such as him. Nie Yan glanced at Dark Gladiator who lumbered over to his side. Its enormous body was covered with scratches and deep-cut marks. However, they were healing at a pace even visible to the naked eye, and it wasn't a simple recovery either. Rather than restoring to their original state, razor-sharp talons resembling blades began forming on the skeletal dragon's claws, and its appearance became much more terrifying. The ghastly, pale cyan flames in its eye sockets flickered, radiating a deathly cold energy that made others not dare to stare at it straight on. Despite its imposing appearance, Dark Gladiator lowered its enormous skull as it kneeled in front of him. As a controlled monster, it was now completely subservient to him, answering his every beck and call. Hence, he was free to command it as he pleased. Nie Yan tilted his head upward and peered at the opening of the pitfall. I should be able to escape from here now. He stepped onto the palm of Dark Gladiator's bony claws and ordered it to raise him higher. As he was elevated to a suitable height, he leaped out of its claws and returned to the surface. Dark Gladiator followed soon after and leaped out of the pitfall as well, the weight of its skeletal frame shaking the ground upon landing. With this super meat shield at his side, he would no longer have to fear those common skeletons. Nie Yan would be under Dark Gladiator's protection for roughly 3 hours, so he would definitely make use of the time by retrieving Sulgada's shadow. Having escaped the underground dungeon, Nie Yan strode forward and headed for Sulgada's center. Following behind was the enormous Dark Gladiator who dwarfed him and the surrounding ruins in size. As soon as Nie Yan arrived in a new area, waves of skeletons would surge towards his position. However, like autumn leaves, they would be smashed apart by Dark Gladiator's sweeping tail. In such a way, his experience bar steadily rose while he advanced toward his destination. Every so often, after letting Dark Gladiator clean up most of the skeletons, he would find a suitable time to cast Undead Rite on the remaining skeleton mages. Hence, in this fashion, he soon formed a party of 6 consisting of Dark Gladiator, 4 skeleton mages, and him. 2 of the skeleton mages specialized in ice magic, 1 in fire, and the other in lightning. All 4 guarded his side. As he traveled through the intricate paths of the outer district, he thought back to the fragmented memories of the time he spent leveling here and seeking out the entrance to the inner district. Leveling here is pretty fast. Nie Yan glanced at his experience bar. In the span of a few dozen minutes, it had already risen by 8%. In the wake of his monstrous clearing speed, the surrounding undead in the vicinity couldn't respawn fast enough. Just as he finished clearing the mobs in an area, he heard sounds of activity at his back. Nie Yan furrowed his brows since it didn't resemble the sounds made by the undead. Voices. There are players here. Leveling here is pretty good, but there's just too many skeletons. We almost lost our lives there. How about we go back and call another priest over? 2 isn't enough. We'll need 3 if we want to continue training here. Having too many priests is inconvenient. How about we call a holy mage? They deal double damage to undead, so our mobbing speed will increase. You're right. Let's go back and recruit a holy mage. There's a leader-class skeleton mage near the end of this path. We'll need to circle around it first. The voices of several players coming from behind startled Nie Yan. Just as he spun around, he happened to see 8 players facing him in the distance after they turned the corner at the end of the path. In the same instant, the voices of the chattering players immediately came to a halt. "Huh! Why did you guys stop talking? Did you all go stupid?" An arcane mage among them asked in a puzzled tone. He then followed his companions' gazes. He immediately lost his voice as well. There, at the end of the path, stood a player dressed in a thief's attire. They could tell with a single glance that his gear, especially the pair of daggers in his hands, was completely out of the ordinary. Why did this thief suddenly appear out of nowhere? What was even more shocking, however, was the enormous bone dragon standing at this player's side. As they stared at its dark metallic red bones, towering body, immense spiked tail, and razor-sharp claws, they could instantly tell it was a tier higher than the common undead roaming around this area. Besides the skeletal dragon, 4 skeleton mages guarded the thief as they loosely gathered by his side. The flickering flames in their eye sockets stared back at the group of players that had just recently emerged. The existence of the enormous bone dragon alone made this thief seem all the more mysterious. Chapter 82. Skeleton Executioners. Thief. Is that an NPC? A mage stammered in question. No, it's a player. Cold shivers traveled down another thief's body as fear grew in his heart. He summoned these skeletons? Is he a necromancer? No, he appears to be a thief. Nie Yan stood silently with the dark gladiator, just looking at them, but also giving them a formless feeling of oppression. This was because he was manipulating the strings of their fates at this moment. If he commanded that enormous skeletal dragon to charge over and added the attacks from the 4 skeletal mages as well, those assembled would have no hope of survival at all. The gloomy, cyan flames in the dark gladiator's eyes flared. It was waiting for Nie Yan's command. It would immediately make a move if he gave the word to attack. Nie Yan used transcendent insight to view the information of these players. Leader Young 7, Forgotten, Nie Yan. All sorts of familiar names floated into view. Level 6, 6, and 5. These people were influential personages in their past lives. Although they hadn't joined any other guilds, they'd formed a team called True Dragon Mark. The strength of this team was roughly on par with the elite teams of the guilds. It was then that Nie Yan recalled that he'd met these players when he was tracking the Serpentine Lizard. This made sense when he thought about it. Players who dared come to Sulgata Ancient City at this level naturally wouldn't be bumbling fools. Leader Young 7 was a player who would be known as one of the 7 archbishops in the future. A strong priest was of utmost importance to a team. They would even have the effect of saving the entire team at critical moments. As for Forgotten, he'd been superior to Nie Yan in his past life and was also one of the thieves who received the moniker of Shadow Dancer. While he had been on roughly the same level as Nie Yan in terms of techniques, he had entered the game earlier and had an elite team. His level and equipment were both superior to Nie Yan. However, circumstances were different now. Nie Yan had more than 10 years of experience as a thief over Forgotten, and in this timeline, they both entered the game at the same time. So their positions would be sure to be rewritten in this life. Perhaps one day, they would be the ones to learn to look up to Nie Yan. As for the others, they weren't as renowned as Leader Young 7 or Forgotten, but they had a small bit of fame as well. Nie Yan, for instance, was not a bad fighter. Although he wasn't ranked in the top 10 of the fighter rankings, he was at least in the top 50. This was still quite a high ranking. After all, the entire righteous faction would have hundreds of thousands of teams 10 years from now. Although Nie Yan had heard of these people before, he'd never come in contact with them. They stared at each other for a while, with a hand that Leader Young 7 was using to grip his staff breaking out in a cold sweat. He didn't display his internal nervousness on his face, however. If Nie Yan made a move, the 6 of them would most likely not make it out alive. They'd naturally be gifting Nie Yan several pieces of equipment. If Nie Yan made a move, it would be a single-sided slaughter. However, Nie Yan had his own thoughts about this matter. These people weren't weak, and although their current levels were low, they would be sure to be elite experts in the future. If Nie Yan gave the order for the Dark Gladiator to charge and kill them, he'd at most get his hands on a few pieces of equipment and a red name. Those pieces of equipment weren't worth much money at all, and he wasn't short on money. Why make so many enemies? They didn't know what he had come to Sulgata for, and he didn't need to worry about someone seizing Sulgata's shadow at this current level. Nie Yan smiled faintly and paid no more attention to these players, heading towards the depths of the city. The Dark Gladiator looked at Nie Yan's back, swiveled its head to look at the players, and then turned to follow him. Several skeletons came pouncing towards Nie Yan. The Dark Gladiator lifted its tail high and sent it crashing down heavily, smashing the skeletons into fragments. No one dared to follow. Whoever followed Nie Yan was courting death. Nie Yan walked away quite dashingly. They'd only had one glance at his face, but it was something that young Seven and the others would never forget. "Wait!" Forgotten called out towards Nie Yan. Nie Yan didn't turn back as he left straight ahead, vanishing at the end of the path. Countless numbers of skeletons poured in, blocking their line of vision and making it so that even the tall Dark Gladiator disappeared from sight as well. Just who was that fellow? He was damn awesome, and he really had summoned those skeletons. Nie Yan mumbled off on the side. This was too frightening if this was the case. Perhaps they weren't summoned creatures. Didn't we get a spirit summoning scroll drop too? He might have gotten something else. Young Seven spoke, deep in thought. Even if this is the case, he's got some skills to dare come to Sulgata alone. "Oh right, Forgotten. What did you call out to him for just now?" Nie Yan asked, perplexed. Since he turned to leave, that proved that he wouldn't do anything to us. It's a good idea to interact more with someone like that. Other people may not be willing to join our team. Young Seven said. Otherwise, Nie Yan wouldn't have turned without another word. It was obvious that he didn't want to have anything to do with them. That's fine too. We'll become familiar with each other after some chatting. I used inspect just now, that guy's called Nie Yan. Forgotten didn't know what he was feeling now either. As a fellow thief, there seemed to be a great gap between him and Nie Yan. Nie Yan. I seem to have heard this name before. One of my friends said once that someone called Nie Yan slaughtered a lot of people in Radiant Sacred Flame. It looks like he's the one. I've also heard that he has some relation to Sleepy Fox. Leader Young Seven said. He had friends in all sorts of places, and his sources of news were more timely. He often gossiped when chatting about news, like which guild had gotten a face full of dust from someone, which guilds had fought each other, etc. Is he someone from Holy Empire? No idea. I didn't see him wear a guild emblem just now. I don't think so. Nie Yan had left them with a deep impression with just one glance. A lone thief had dared to charge into Sulgata. This was why they felt deep respect for him. If they stumbled upon a chance to create good relations with Nie Yan or recruit him into their team, they would definitely jump on it. Nie Yan moved towards the center of the city, following along the passages within the maze-like outer district. He didn't know about the intentions and plans of those behind him. If he knew that they wanted to recruit him for their team, he would have told them to give up. Nie Yan wouldn't listen to anyone else's commands. He joined the elites of Holy Empire only to get his hands on some equipment. He did want to form a team, but the reins of command had to be in his hands. The Dark Gladiator rushed forward fiercely, slamming groups of monsters to death. Under this freakish speed of mob killing, Nie Yan's experience bar filled up rapidly. He made his way through a patch of maze and entered an open square. It measured several thousand meters in radius, and the tall, rugged pyramid structure was in the center. Scores of tall and stocky skeleton executioners were patrolling around the center of the square. They were at least 5 meters tall, and were moving skeletons. Their right arms were noticeably thicker as they carried heavy axes. The axes were spotted with rust, but were still quite ferocious. Chapter 83. Expressing Goodwill. Skeleton Executioner, Sub-Elite Level 13. Health. 1200/1200. These skeleton executioners had even more health than Dark Gladiator, not to mention they were quite numerous as well. However, the caveat was once they were killed, they would never respawn again. Although he had visited Sulgata in the original timeline, these skeleton executioners had long been exterminated. Presumably, they were placed there for the sole purpose of guarding and preventing intruders from stealing the piece of Sulgata's shadow. Even though he knew a group of players had retrieved the piece from this city in the past, He wasn't aware of the price they had to pay to do so. He could imagine the bitter struggles those players must have gone through as he observed the skeleton executioners roaming this area. I didn't expect there to be so many sub-elites. Nie Yan muttered under his breath as his brows furrowed. However, thinking it over, it made sense that a legendary grade item such as Sulgada's Shadow would have the protection of many strong monsters, even if just a single piece. He calmly observed the area's topography to determine if it was possible to make a detour. Unfortunately, the area was too open, meaning he would be spotted as soon as he showed himself. As for any cover he could make use of, he spotted a lone pillar standing in the distance, something far from being adequate. Another possible method was to have Dark Gladiator lead the skeleton executioners away, giving him an opportunity to sneak in. However, he felt uneasy facing the hidden dangers that might lurk within the pyramid with no help accompanying him. Sacrificing Dark Gladiator simply wasn't worth the risk. He retreated for now and pondered over the matter while farming the weaker undead mobs in the vicinity. Is it possible to turn the skeleton executioners into servants? Nie Yan ordered Dark Gladiator to retreat inside the outer district and remain on standby. He jumped onto the outer district's border walls and retrieved the crossbow of blood from his inventory, then aligned the sight on the skeleton executioners. 52 meters. Too far. 50 meters. Still too far. Just as he was about to leave to find a more suitable position, a lone skeleton executioner started moving towards him, drawing progressively close. Perfect. Nie Yan pulled the trigger at whoosh. 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 3 bolts pierced the air and successively struck their target. The cyan flames in the skeleton executioner's eye sockets flickered as it tilted its head and locked its gaze onto the aggressor positioned atop the wall. It immediately brandished its gigantic axe and charged at Nie Yan. The skeleton executioner emitted an odd roar that resembled the grinding of a bulldozer, swinging its axe wildly as it lumbered over. The commotion also caused the nearby 30-plus skeleton executioners to come forward. Seeing the skeleton executioner about to smash the wall with its gigantic axe, Nie Yan jumped off the wall and withdrew at the last possible moment. Boom! The large axe struck the eroded wall, breaking it as if it were rotten wood and bringing down large chunks of stone. Boom! 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 Several dozen thunderous strikes followed the first, and the walls rapidly collapsed, allowing the skeleton executioners to enter the outer district. Nie Yan ran backwards, his eyes remaining fixed on the crumbling wall as he avoided the flying debris. He found a suitable opening and cast Undead Right, which took away 30% of his health in an instant. A wisp of light struck a skeleton executioner and entered its body. Its movements momentarily froze. However, in the next moment, the skeleton executioner broke free of the spell's bindings and charged towards Nie Yan with its axe raised. Damn it, it failed. He promptly rolled out of the way, dodging the oncoming axe. He then dashed toward a nearby wall, scaled over it, and hopped off on the other side. In this fashion, he traversed through the labyrinth-like outer district with the skeleton executioners in tow. After destroying several walls without finding Nie Yan, the skeleton executioners finally gave up and returned to the pyramid. There were just too many of them, which made it quite difficult to find a suitable opportunity to cast Undead Right. Not to mention the low success rate, even if he succeeded by some lucky fluke, his new servant would be hacked to pieces by the other skeleton executioners almost immediately. Although there'd be one less to deal with, he could only imagine how tedious and inefficient it would be to use this method to enter the pyramid. At the very minimum, it would take him 2 to 3 days to clear the area of skeleton executioners. Retrieving that piece of Sulgada's Shadow is going to be more problematic than I initially thought. In the end, Nie Yan had no choice but to helplessly linger around the outer district, allowing Dark Gladiator to clean up the surrounding mobs. Fortunately, the leveling speed was quite fast, which could count as a small consolation. Before 3 hours were fully up, Nie Yan had cast Undead Right 3 more times but made 0 headway in recruiting a skeleton executioner. In a mere half-hour or so, Dark Gladiator would disappear. Don't tell me! I have to just forget about it and try again later? However, if he decided to give up today, he might not be as lucky next time in finding an amazing servant like Dark Gladiator again. In addition, there was no guarantee another player wouldn't snatch the piece of Sulgada's Shadow before he returned. Just as he was racking his brain over this problem, he heard the voices of nearby players enter his ear. "It's these guys again." Nie Yan wrinkled his brows. Since the last time he met them, those players had finally explored their way here. With the presence of outsiders, he wouldn't be able to execute his plans without a hitch. Before he retrieved the piece of Sulgada's shadow, he didn't want to allow any others to become aware of its existence. However, he realized that even if they arrived here, once they saw how many skeleton executioners there were in the vicinity, they wouldn't even dare to take half a step forward, let alone have any thoughts of entering the pyramid. Unless they were all over level 10 and brought a much larger group of players along with them, it would be impossible to clear the opening of all the skeleton executioners. Nie Yan still had ample time to retrieve Sulgada's shadow. In the same moment, 6 players entered Nie Yan's view. The players were greeted by the sight of an enormous skeleton dragon standing by Nie Yan's side like a dutiful guardian. The ghostly flames in its eye sockets seemed to follow their every move. Meanwhile, beside the thief also stood 3 skeleton mages with their staffs brandished, ready to attack at any time, not letting their guards down in the slightest. While within the safety of a city or a town, players maintained amiable attitudes and often befriended others. As soon as they stepped into the wilderness, however, their demeanors would completely reverse. Any stranger could become a potential enemy since everyone feared being plotted against or being ambushed by other players. Oftentimes, even simple misunderstandings could lead to an endless bloodbath. So even though Nie Yan had Dark Gladiator at his side, if those 6 players simultaneously attacked him, he'd still end up dying in a short amount of time. Thus, he had no choice but to keep his guard up against them at all times. Leader Young 7, Forgotten, and the others also noticed Nie Yan's presence at the same time and halted. "Greetings, we mean no harm." Forgotten was the first one to speak up. Their group of 6 were also extremely cautious. After all, their life and death lay in how Nie Yan viewed them. "Whether your intentions are bad or not makes no difference to me," Nie Yan indifferently replied, taking the initiative to establish which side held dominance. Young 7 and the others glanced at Dark Gladiator that stood by Nie Yan's side. In truth, his statement was absolutely correct. With such a terrifying servant under his command, it really didn't matter if they had come to provoke him or not. "We came here simply because we wanted to befriend you. Besides, I believe there haven't been any cases where we've offended you in the past," Young 7 answered as he calmly took a step forward and gazed at Nie Yan. Although they appeared to be at a complete disadvantage, Young 7's bearing was neither servile nor overbearing. Pretty courageous. He was certainly worthy of being called one of the most outstanding players in his original timeline. Seemingly disregarding life and death, he staked his life in order to move one step closer toward Nie Yan. Nie Yan had a change of heart. Since he hadn't found a way of entering the pyramid on his own, Young 7 and his team might be able to help. Chapter 84. Aggroing Monsters. As Young 7 observed Nie Yan's taciturn appearance, a certain thought drifted through his mind. Why did he enter Sulgada all by himself? There must have been a reason. Maybe a quest of some sort? I assume you came here for a reason. Do you need any help? Young 7 took the initiative to ask. Even with these undead servants, I'm still not confident I'll be able to succeed. Are you certain you want to help? Nie Yan stared at Young 7 and the others as he narrowed his eyes. Upon hearing Nie Yan's rather straightforward response, Young 7 and his squadmates felt their minds turn to mush. If he couldn't accomplish his task even with that giant bone dragon by his side, then what use would they be? Encountering each other here could be considered fate. At the very least, we're not enemies, so if we can provide any assistance, we'll do our best to provide it. Even if we can't, we'll have at least made another friend, right? Young 7 replied in an affable manner. Nie Yan slightly relaxed his mind. In his previous life, he never interacted with Young 7, Forgotten, or anyone else in their group, so he wasn't sure of their personalities. Right now, however, they seemed to be pretty easy to get along with. Perhaps they really could become friends. He went on to ponder in silence. The skeletal executioners always seemed to move together. If Young 7 and his team could draw them away, then perhaps he'd have a shot at entering the pyramid. There would certainly be monsters guarding the interior, but he could just let Dark Gladiator deal with them. If things went smoothly, He might actually reach the room where the piece of Sulgada's shadow was located. While Nie Yan continued to ponder deeply, young Seven, Forgotten, and the rest of the team shot meaningful glances at each other. Although they didn't know exactly what he was thinking about, he was still a dangerous figure that could annihilate their entire team. If Nie Yan still declined their offer to help, they would have no other choice but to stay as far away as possible. If we can't help, then let's just leave, suggested Forgotten. Young Seven suddenly came to realization upon hearing Forgotten's suggestion. Since Nie Yan definitely came here with a purpose, perhaps for a secret quest of some sort, their presence here might actually be a hindrance to him. If that was the case, wouldn't they be worsening their relationship with him instead by attempting to help? Even now, Nie Yan still hadn't given a reply. It's best if we just take our leave then, young Seven concluded. He turned to Forgotten and replied, "Since we won't be able to help, let's forget it. It's about time we return to town anyway." His voice just happened to be within earshot of Nie Yan. Their conversation dispelled any misgivings he might have previously held and informed him they were willing to leave. "It's not that you won't be able to help. But first, how about we make a little deal?"
Nie Yan suddenly interrupted.
"What kind of deal?" Young Seven asked. "I need you to help me with a certain task. It's quite dangerous, but if you succeed, I'll give you a gold-grade piece of equipment." Nie Yan still had the shoulder guards in his bag. Although it was a gold-grade item with decent properties, it was negligible when compared to Sulgada's shadow. If young Seven and the others were truly willing to help him, he wouldn't be miserly when it came to rewards. In the game's current stage, gold-grade equipment was fairly rare. Young Seven, Forgotten, and the rest of the team privately conversed amongst themselves. To illustrate just how rare gold-grade equipment was, their team had only managed to acquire 2 gold-grade pieces of equipment since the game started. Not to mention, they had to go through hell and back each time just to retrieve them. Yet Nie Yan, a player unassociated with any guilds, was actually willing to give one out so easily. This meant his skill was clearly on another level. Young Seven made a firm resolve in his mind. They definitely had to befriend him. "Brother, since you've asked this of us, we can only try our best. As for compensating us, you don't have to bother," young Seven replied in a bright tone. A measly gold-grade item was nothing as long as they could establish a good relationship with Nie Yan. If they helped him without accepting a reward, then he would owe them a favor. Accepting help without giving anything in return? That won't do. So long as you help me here, I promise to pay back the favor in the future. Sounds good. So, what do you need us to do? Young Seven asked. "Well, how about we introduce ourselves first? My name is Nie Yan, Nirvana Flame. I'm leader Young Seven, but you can just call me Young Seven. As for me, I'm Forgotten." And thus, the rest of Young Seven's team introduced themselves. Although their skills couldn't be compared to Nie Yan's, they were still all talented individuals who weren't half bad. "We don't have much time, so just follow me for now," Nie Yan said as he headed deeper into the outer district. Young Seven and the rest followed close behind. The numerous skeleton executioners had wreaked havoc upon the outer district. The already eroded buildings had become even more ruined, and many of the walls were collapsed. After Nie Yan and the others arrived at the limits of the outer district, they hid behind a collapsed wall and gazed over at the plaza which led to the pyramid. There they saw over 30 skeleton executioners roaming around freely, each one a level 13 sub-elite monster. "He can't possibly be thinking of having us fight these monsters, right?" Young Seven and his team couldn't help but have this thought as they felt their scalps turning numb. However, they didn't voice out their concerns. They didn't want to look weak in front of Nie Yan. Killing a single skeleton executioner wouldn't be a problem for their team, but taking on a group this large was surely impossible. "Let me explain the plan. There are 33 skeleton executioners total. They all move in one group, so if you attack one of them, the others will follow. What I want you guys to do is to lure them away," Nie Yan explained. If Young Seven and his team could lead these skeleton executioners away, then he would be able to pass through the plaza and safely enter the pyramid. "You only want us to lead them away, right?" Young Seven asked, mentally sighing a breath of relief. Thankfully that was all he was asking of them. Although the task was still dangerous, it was nothing compared to actually fighting them. Yeah, I only need you to draw them away. It doesn't have to be for long either. Around 30 seconds will be enough, Nie Yan replied. Half a minute was more than sufficient for him to pass through the plaza and reach the pyramid. Alright, that makes things a bit easier. I want you guys aggro them from here. Let me move to another location first. When I'm ready, I'll give you guys the signal. Dissolve your party and accept my invite, Nie Yan instructed. With other players helping him, entering the pyramid was going to be much easier. All right. Once Young 7 disbanded his party, Nie Yan promptly invited everyone into his own. Perfect, I'll be leaving it up to you then, Nie Yan said, his tone sounding not nearly as cold as before. Rest assured, Young 7 nodded his head and replied. Nie Yan was quite polite. It seemed this was going to be the start of a beautiful friendship. Nie Yan brought Dark Gladiator and the skeleton mages with him to another position. His figure gradually became smaller in the distance. I just took a look. That bone dragon by Nie Yan's side is a genuine sub-elite monster. Forgotten exclaimed in shock. What a godly player. Even a sub-elite undead isn't out of his reach. I wonder how long it lasts. Maybe it's permanent. It shouldn't be permanent. I was able to see more information when I used Inspect. That thing only has 20 minutes left before it disappears, Young 7 replied. Still, even if that was the case, Nie Yan was still pretty incredible. No wonder he seemed to be in a rush. Hey, what do you think he wants to enter the pyramid for? I think it's probably a hidden quest. Coming here to do a quest at this level, does he not care about dying? Who knows? He's in position. I'll go out and draw aggro, Forgotten said after glancing at the team chat. You be careful now, we're dealing with 30+ sub-elites after all, Young 7 warned Forgotten. Understood. Heh, I can handle myself. You don't need to worry. Forgotten sheathed his dagger and took out a small crossbow, then walked closer to the square. Young 7 and his team were positioned to the northeast of the square, while Nie Yan was positioned to the northwest. Coincidentally, Nie Yan was able to see their situation from his position, so after he sent a message through the team chat, he saw Forgotten stepping out from behind a rock pile and slowly approach the skeleton executioners while crouching, crossbow in hand. By the time Forgotten found an adequate position, the closest skeleton executioner was already within the range of his crossbow. He aimed at the skeleton executioner and fired, whoosh! A single bolt pierced through the air. Chapter 85. Secret Compartment. The crossbow bolt arced through the air and struck the nearest skeleton executioner directly in the chest. After being suddenly attacked, it let out a furious roar and charged toward Forgotten. The roar also alerted the surrounding skeleton executioners, who stampeded toward Forgotten in a large mob. Crap, they're all coming over. Seeing this, Forgotten immediately turned tail and leaped over the pile of rocks, fleeing for his life. After all, who would dare stay still when faced with such a terrifying sight? Yet this was only the beginning. They had been tasked with keeping these skeleton executioners distracted for at least half a minute, which meant their job was far from over. Nie Yan watched from the sidelines as the skeleton executioners stampeded toward the northeast. As their silhouettes grew distant, the plaza was soon emptied of their presence. Thus, Nie Yan brought Dark Gladiator and the rest of his undead toward the pyramid's entrance. Boom! 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 Thunderous noises reverberated from northeast of the plaza as the mob of skeleton executioners wreaked havoc upon the remaining ruins, causing the walls to topple over and collapse. In addition, volleys of magic could periodically be seen flying through the air, raining down upon the mob. The spells were coming from Young 7 and the others, who, for the sake of stalling for time, didn't hesitate to attack the group despite being well aware of the risks. It appeared these players were quite earnest in helping him out. If they truly did end up helping him retrieve the fragment of Sulgada's shadow, then not only would he honor the favor he owed them, he would also gift them the gold-grade shoulder guards regardless of their prior refusal. Even in games, if a person gave their word, then they should keep it. It was by far the simplest way to get along with others. And getting along with others was essential to establishing a large network of contacts. When one encountered a situation and required assistance, it became more convenient to find help. System. Player round stool has died. As he glanced at the party window, Nie Yan saw the highlighted text of a player's name turn dark. This meant a member from Young Seven's group had been killed. Aggroing these skeleton executioners was a dangerous task. It came as no surprise that 1 or 2 players would end up dying. As the battle in the northeast raged on, Nie Yan became ever more concerned about how much longer they could hold out for. At this point, however, all he could do was hope for the best as he accelerated his pace towards the pyramid. Bringing the skeleton mages along would be much too cumbersome. Thus, before he and Dark Gladiator moved towards the pyramid, he ordered them to farm monsters in the surrounding area and left them to their own devices. He and Dark Gladiator dashed through the plaza and safely arrived at the pyramid's entrance. The entrance, which appeared to be 2 solid metal gates carved with ancient, intricate designs, wasn't all that large. Though, through the passing of the ages, their beauty had long since faded, giving way to rust and the dilapidation of time. "I've already entered the pyramid. Hurry up and leave," Nie Yan said through the party's voice channel. However, just as those words exited his mouth, another player's name turned dark. A second member of Young Seven's team had been killed. For the sake of aiding him, they had made sacrifices that couldn't be considered negligible. Fortunately, they were able to retrieve the equipment that had dropped from those who died. "Roger, we'll be taking our leave then," Young Seven replied. If they stayed any longer, it would be hard to predict what else might happen, so after receiving Nie Yan's go-ahead, the remaining members immediately withdrew from the battle. "Thanks for this. I'll give you the equipment when I get back." "No problem. We'll be in the area farming mobs for a bit before returning to town." After entering the pyramid, Nie Yan walked through a dark, long and narrow passageway along a flight of stairs. Relying on his past knowledge, he carefully avoided all the hidden traps along the path. The hidden mechanisms in this passage were all extremely dangerous and would result in instant death for anyone unlucky enough to trigger them. Nie Yan was quite cautious as he advanced along the path, not daring to reveal the slightest degree of carelessness. Fortunately, no matter what manner of trap appeared, none of them were new to him since he had encountered every single one in his previous life. Therefore, as long as he wasn't careless, none of these traps would pose any threat to him. Advancing down the path, an eerie chill that made his blood run cold seemed to come from the depths of the pyramid. As Nie Yan reached the end of the passageway, he was met with a dead end. All that lay ahead was a large stagnant pool of water. The way leading to the interior of the pyramid was underneath this pool. Nie Yan dived into the water and swam towards the depths while Dark Gladiator followed from behind. As an undead, Dark Gladiator didn't need to breathe. Thus, it wouldn't matter how long it stayed submerged underwater. It was a sealed underwater passage. In every direction, left and right, above and below, were smooth stone walls while the path ahead was dark and foreboding. The path was so dark it was nearly impossible to make anything out. Nie Yan continued to swim ahead, though he wasn't rushing at all, so if by any chance he encountered a monster while underwater, he'd have ample time to react. Just at that moment, Nie Yan suddenly felt something peculiar about the stone wall to his left, and his heart leapt out in alarm. There was a hidden mechanism inside the wall. He only had time to see 2 sharp, black arrowheads emerge from it. Whoosh! Whoosh! 2 arrows shot out, leaving a trail of bubbles behind them while flying directly at Nie Yan. He did an underwater roll and leaned his head to the side, and almost immediately after, an arrow streaked past his cheek and left side. Just by a hair's breadth, he had nearly been struck in the head and heart. Luckily though, he had a good reaction speed. The 2 arrows merely ended up embedded on the opposite wall. After this close call, he became even more cautious and prudent. Proceeding further into the depths of the underwater passage, his eyes happened to glance over at a certain area on the wall to his right where he discovered peculiar scratch marks, other markings, and what appeared to be ancient characters above them. In the previous timeline, very few players, if any at all, who arrived here would be able to recognize these characters scribbled on the wall. Nie Yan, on the other hand, recognized these marks and characters. They were the secret totemic marking of the dragons, and as for the 2 eroded characters above, they were also the language of the dragons. Since Nie Yan had learned dragon tongue from the annals of shared governance, he was immediately able to recognize these characters. Legends told that before city perished, the Lord of Solgata secretly hid all his treasures somewhere inside the city. Believing these legends to be true, in his previous life, players searched every nook and cranny of the city, yet no one was able to find even a hint of their whereabouts. The dragons believed in destruction, exercising their faith in flame and incineration, which desired the eradication of everything in existence. It was certain the totemic marking on the wall possessed a unique origin. Upon feeling a sense of suffocation suddenly come from his chest, he realized that he seemed to be running out of breath, so in response, he activated the underwater breathing ability of the water aversion pearl and began searching around the wall. However, excluding a few minute cracks, it was as smooth as a mirror, and he couldn't find any peculiarities whatsoever. Could I just be overthinking things? He was convinced the dragon totemic markings appearing in this location wasn't a simple matter. Paying heed to his conviction, he expanded the range of his search and reached his hands into a nook beneath the wall. There, his hands happened to pass over 5 cavities roughly the size of a fingerprint. These 5 cavities were so faint that they were extremely easy to miss if one passed over them carelessly. Perhaps, a secret lay in these 5 cavities. He placed the fingers on his right hand over the cavities, and as he slowly exerted pressure over them, they began sinking inward. Rumble! Rumble! A slab of stone an arm's length away from him slowly protruded outward. There was a secret compartment inside this wall. The activating mechanism to this compartment was extremely well hidden. Unless someone searched for a lengthy period of time, they would have no hopes of discovering it. Although he didn't know if any players discovered the totemic markings in his previous life, he definitely never heard of anyone finding this hidden compartment.